Hello friends. This month has been tough for the channel and I need your support. It feels like the videos aren't reaching everyone. Please like, comment, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. Thank you, and now let's begin. My name is Kavi, shortened from Kavi, a name that means falls from the mountain in the language of my ancestors. When people ask why a ranger with a decade of experience in better-funded parks would transfer to the Appalachian backcountry, I tell them it was the solitude. That's mostly true. The real reason was harder to explain. After 12 years managing crowds at Yosemite, processing incident reports, and filling out bureaucratic forms in triplicate, I found myself staring at the ceiling of my apartment at 3 in the morning, asking why I was still doing this work. The answer came quietly, because I'd forgotten why I'd started. I'd forgotten what it meant to protect something sacred and untouched. The Appalachian National Forest Service offered me a remote ranger post on the Bear Ridge sector, 18,000 acres of dense forest, limestone caves, and isolation so complete that radio contact was unreliable. No crowds, no gift shops, no cell service except from the ridgetop, 3 miles from my cabin. The job was as simple as it was demanding: patrol, maintain trails, assist lost hikers, maintain the emergency shelter at Clearwater Lake, and submit monthly reports. I accepted within a week. The cabin sits a quarter-mile back from Clearwater Lake, constructed in 1987 from weathered logs and stone. Someone had renovated it in the early 2000s, added real plumbing, propane heating, a reinforced roof. It's small: bedroom, kitchen, office with radio equipment, storage room. The previous ranger, an older man named Marcus, had left comprehensive notes about the sector. Most of it was routine. One section made me pause. "The calls come in summer," he'd written in the margins of a patrol map. "People report hearing voices in the forest, usually kids on overnight hikes. They panic, call for rescue. You'll find them fine, a bit shaken. They always describe the same thing: someone calling their name from the woods. Tell them it's just acoustics, wind through the caves." They seem relieved by the explanation. I'd made note of it and moved on. Every sector has local myths, exaggerated stories that grow with retelling. My first month was uneventful. I hiked the trails, replenished supplies at the shelter, checked in with the regional office. The work was good, physical. The forest was beautiful in a way that felt genuine, not curated for tourism, but wild in the way things are when nobody's watching. The silence became a kind of comfort. At night, I'd sit on the porch with coffee and listen to the wind move through the canopy. It was early July when the first call came through. The radio crackled around dusk. A group of 5 hikers from Virginia had started at the Ashford trailhead that morning. One of them, a 17-year-old girl named Devon, had gotten separated from the group around 4 o'clock. Her parents, calling from a hotel in town, were frantic. I was the only ranger available. I gathered gear: flashlight, first aid, extra water, a whistle, and headed toward the Ashford trailhead. It was a 40-minute walk through failing light. The trail was well marked, but as darkness settled, the forest became less forgiving. Trees that seemed distant became looming shapes. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in pale clouds. I found the group at mile 2, 3 adults and 2 younger hikers huddled near the trail marker. They'd backtracked when Devon didn't reappear. Her father, a thick-armed man in an expensive hiking jacket, started talking before I'd finished introducing myself. She was right behind us. We stopped to get water from the stream. When we turned around, she was gone. "We've been calling. She's not answering. Something's wrong, something's—" "It's okay," I said, keeping my voice level. "The forest can confuse people. She probably heard you calling and went the wrong direction. I'll find her." I radioed back to the cabin, logged the search, and got descriptions of what Devon was wearing. Then I sent the family back down the trail toward the trailhead while I went up into the darkening forest. The Ashford Trail climbs through thick, deciduous forest before reaching a plateau of hemlock and spruce. The trees pressed close. My flashlight carved a tunnel through the dark. I called Devon's name at intervals, waited for a response. The forest absorbed the sound as if it had never been made. That's when I heard it. "Devon." A voice, thin and hollow, from somewhere to my right. "Devon, help." I turned, moving toward the voice. "Devon, I'm a ranger. Keep calling so I can find you." The response came again, the same inflection, same phrasing. "Devon, help. Devon, help." Something about it was wrong. The voice sounded exactly like it had the first time. Not a live person adjusting their call, but a recording. The same word stress, the same breath pattern. I stopped moving. The voice came again, closer now, but still no sign of anyone. "Devon, help!" I clicked my radio. "I've got a situation. I'm at mile 3 on Ashford. I'm hearing vocalizations that..." A shriek cut through the forest. Human, female, high-pitched with genuine terror. It came from upslope. Without thinking, I moved toward it. The forest opened into a small clearing. My flashlight found nothing, just trees and moss-covered rocks. The shrieking had stopped. I called Devon's name repeatedly. Nothing came back but silence. 20 minutes of searching yielded nothing. No sign of disturbance, no clothing, no blood, no tracks in the soft soil. The temperature seemed to have dropped further. My hands were numb. I marked the coordinates and continued upslope, calling regularly. I found her 40 minutes later, sitting on a limestone outcrop 100 yards from the trail, crying. She was unharmed. No scratches, no indication she'd been anywhere near the clearing where I'd heard the screaming. "I got confused," she said through tears. "I heard my dad calling me, but when I went toward the sound, it kept moving. It kept moving away. I tried to follow it, but I got lost. Then I just sat down because I was scared." I didn't tell her about the voice I'd heard, or the screaming. "You did the right thing. Staying in place is correct when you're lost." As I walked her back down to meet her family, she asked, "Did you hear something in the woods when you were looking for me?" "The forest carries sound in strange ways," I said. "Echoes bounce off the rock formations. It can be confusing." She nodded, but I could see she didn't quite believe me. Back at the cabin that night, I reviewed Marcus's notes again. "The calls come in summer. You'll find them fine, a bit shaken. They always describe the same thing, someone calling their name from the woods." I made a new note. "Acoustic phenomena confirmed. Limestone caves create distinct echo patterns. Recommend hikers maintain group discipline." It seemed reasonable. It seemed like something that would comfort me later, when the alternative became harder to deny. By late July, there had been 3 more incidents. Each time, someone reported hearing voices calling their names from the forest. Each time, the person in question was found unharmed but deeply unsettled. Each time, they described the same experience, following a voice that sounded familiar, that seemed to know their name, that led them deeper into the forest than any reasonable person should go. The local hiking community began posting about it online. A forum thread appeared. "Weird voices in Appalachian backcountry." People shared stories. Someone mentioned that the previous ranger had documented similar incidents. A skeptic suggested mass hysteria. Others defended the reality of their experiences. I did my job. I submitted incident reports. I noted the acoustic properties of the Bear Ridge sector. I increased patrols on the popular trails. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd actually heard that night with Devon, but I started keeping better notes. Not official ones. Personal observations recorded in a leather journal I kept in my cabin. July 22, hikers report hearing voices on the Redstone Trail. Located 1 missing person, 14M at mile 1.5, sitting in a gully. Says voice sounded like his brother. His brother was 40 miles away. July 29, group of 3 at Clearwater Lake Shelter report hearing someone calling from the water. No one found. Lake is clean. Checked records. No deaths recorded here since 1967. August 3, got a call from a research team camped in the northern sector. Said they heard voices outside their tent. Called in someone calling their names. When I arrived, they were packing to leave, refused to discuss details. August 7, returned to the clearing where I heard the screaming in July. Spent 2 hours looking for any explanation. Nothing. No trails leading to the location, no evidence of recent disturbance, but there was a smell. Faint, chemical, like formaldehyde mixed with rotting meat. I was alone in the forest more than any human should be. That becomes dangerous. You start to trust your own interpretations less. You start to question what you've heard, seen, felt. You start to wonder if the forest is teaching you something about yourself. The answer came from an unexpected direction. A researcher named Dr. Pamela Kovak arrived at my cabin in mid-August. She was with a university wildlife biology program, studying predator-prey relationships in remote Appalachian sectors. She'd heard about the incidents through official channels and wanted to coordinate her research with my patrols. She seemed competent, professional, and skeptical of the supernatural explanations that were spreading online. "It's a mimicry phenomenon," she said over coffee on my porch. "Certain species can replicate human vocalizations, primates obviously, some birds. There's a documented case from Brazil where jaguars vocalize in patterns that seem to mimic human speech to attract victims. Different mechanism, similar effect." "You think there's a large primate in this sector?" I asked. "I think something is using vocalization to separate people from groups. That's predatory behavior. It doesn't require the animal to be humanoid. It just requires intelligence and hunger. I wanted to believe her. Her explanation was clean, scientific, grounded in observable animal behavior. But something in my gut resisted it. The voice I'd heard hadn't sounded like an animal trying to mimic human speech. It had sounded like a human voice processed through something that wasn't quite human. "Have you documented anything?" I asked. "Not yet, but I plan to camp in the high forest for 2 weeks. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, audio recording. If something's out there, I'll find evidence." She stayed in the shelter at Clearwater Lake. I checked on her every 2 days, bringing supplies. She seemed undisturbed by her isolation. She showed me her camera traps, sophisticated equipment that would photograph any large animal moving through the marked zones. She had audio recorders positioned around the shelter, capturing ambient forest sounds. "Establish baseline data," she explained. "Then we'll know when something deviates." On the 5th day of her research, she found something. The audio from the night before contained voices, multiple voices, calling her name. Not screaming, not distressed, just calling. "Pamela, Pamela. It's okay, Pamela. Come outside." She played it for me in the small office at the shelter. Headphones so I could hear the clarity. The voices sounded like different people, but beneath the variations there was something unified about them. A quality that made them seem less like multiple speakers and more like one source creating different masks. "That's fascinating," she said. Not frightened, but genuinely interested. "That's not a single animal vocalizing. That's either multiple animals working cooperatively or..." She stopped. "Or what?" I asked. "Or something with extreme vocal control, a range of frequencies and patterns that shouldn't be possible for a terrestrial mammal." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know," she admitted. "Not yet. I need more data." She set up new equipment, more sensitive recorders, wider range thermal imaging. She seemed less bothered than before, energized by the mystery. She prepared to spend another 10 days in the forest. I should have said something. I should have told her what I'd experienced. Instead, I told myself she was a professional, that she could handle it, that maybe between the two of us we'd solve whatever this was. It was a mistake born from my own denial, my need to believe there was a rational explanation waiting to be found. On August 20, she stopped responding to check-ins. The search for Dr. Kovak lasted 3 days. I followed standard protocol, radioed for backup, organized a coordinated search pattern, maintained detailed logs of every location checked. 2 additional rangers arrived from the regional office. We brought dogs. We checked every known shelter, every marked trail, every location where someone injured might hole up. We found her camp undisturbed. Her tent was closed. Her equipment was still recording. Her supplies, untouched, were still organized on the shelter table. It was as if she'd simply stepped out into the forest and vanished. The audio equipment, though, had captured something. I listened to the recording with the other rangers playing in the background. The quality degraded over the 12 hours of capture, as if something was systematically interfering with the equipment. But the first few hours were clear. Pamela's voice calm. "The voices are outside. Multiple sources. They're calling my name clearly, intelligently. Sophisticated vocalizations. I'm going to approach the perimeter with the thermal imaging. This is remarkable." Sounds of her moving. Zipper, footsteps, then other voices. Dozens of them, it seemed. But they all sounded similar beneath the variations. They all had that quality of unified difference, like an instrument trying to produce harmony by playing the same note slightly out of tune. They called her name in patterns, not random, methodical. Approaching, retreating, approaching from different angles, drawing her attention in different directions. She spoke occasionally, observations, scientific notations, but her voice grew quieter. Then, a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was almost laughter, but the acoustics were wrong. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It sounded like wind through a canyon, except there were no canyons nearby. It sounded like voices speaking in unison, except there was no meaning to the sound. Her final recording was just breathing, harsh and rapid, and something moving through the forest with no attempt at quiet. The sound of whatever it was grew louder, closer, then the audio cut out entirely. The rangers who heard this with me had different reactions. One wanted to call in federal investigators. One thought it was a hoax, that she'd staged her own disappearance to publicize her research. Both had left by the next morning, eager to escape the forest. I stayed. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not acceptance exactly, but resignation. The forest wasn't going to give me the luxury of doubt much longer. I spent the following days in the library of my own research, pulling everything I could access about vocal mimicry, predatory behavior, and documented incidents in the region. What I found was fragmentary and strange. A 1970s article in a cryptozoology journal documented a series of disappearances in the Appalachian Range. Hikers, hunters, researchers, all had reported similar phenomena before vanishing. The article was written by someone named Arthur Voss, who suggested the incidents reflected the territory of an undocumented primate species. His conclusion was that the creature used vocalization as a hunting strategy, isolating prey from groups, creating confusion and disorientation, then approaching under cover of darkness. A different source, much older, was a collection of folk stories compiled by a Depression-era researcher. In those tales there were creatures known as the callers. They lived in deep forests and could reproduce any sound they heard. Hunters and settlers reported that the callers would mimic the voices of family members to lure people away from safety. Some accounts mentioned finding nothing but scattered clothing. Others described witnesses who survived but were left unable to speak clearly, their own voices seeming to belong to someone else. The folklore was clearer than the science. Something in the deep forest had learned to use human voices against us. I increased my patrols, but I changed my methodology. I no longer went alone to search for lost people. I organized groups through the regional office. I moved people quickly out of the northern sector. I implemented new rules. Anyone entering the backcountry had to file detailed itineraries and maintain constant radio contact. The incidents stopped, or rather, they changed. August 29, I received a call from someone identifying as Thomas Radford, a research coordinator from the university. Said Dr. Kovak's equipment had been recovered and her final data was critical. Could I meet him at Clearwater Lake Shelter to authenticate the findings? I said no. He called back 3 times over the next 2 hours, his voice becoming more insistent. The tone of his voice, the slight hesitations, the repetition of phrases, made me refuse to leave the cabin. No ranger with that name existed in the regional database. September 2, the radio received a distress signal from someone claiming to be lost on Redstone Trail. The voice was female, frightened, calling for immediate assistance. I tried to verify the call through the regional office. No missing person had been reported. The next morning, I found evidence that something had been outside my cabin. Scratches on the door, tracks in the garden that looked almost human but were stretched too long, the stride too wide. September 5, I heard it directly. I was on the porch at dusk, watching the forest edge. A voice called from the tree line, clear and unmistakable. Kavi. It was my voice, my exact voice, speaking my name. Not my sister's voice mimicking me, not a reasonable approximation. It was me, exactly as I sounded, speaking from outside the circle of lamplight. Kavi, help me. I didn't move. My hand went to the knife I'd started carrying, not because I believed it would help, but because I needed something to hold. The voice called again. Different words this time, but still perfectly my voice. I need to come home. The thing was, using my own voice against me, the implications made me want to scream. It knew me. It could produce my sounds so perfectly that I couldn't distinguish between my own memory of speaking and its recreation. That kind of precision required more than animal intelligence. It required something that had learned to be me. I went inside and locked the doors, bolted them. I kept every light on all night. When I finally tried to sleep, I kept hearing my own voice calling from the darkness outside. The infection, for lack of a better word, was spreading deeper into my mind. I couldn't trust my own ears anymore. Every sound in the forest, every whisper in the pines, might be real or might be the creatures mimicking what I expected to hear. My sense of isolation became almost suffocating. I was safer with the voices than without them because at least I could track them, anticipate them. The regional office wanted to relocate me. They'd documented the incidents, read the reports on Dr. Kovak. They were being careful to use language that implied the incidents were environmental hazards, acoustic phenomena, psychological stress related to isolation. But the subtext was clear. The ranger position at Bear Ridge had become untenable. I refused to leave, not because I thought I could solve the problem, but because I realized that the creatures had learned to isolate people using something more effective than their voices. They used hope. They used the belief that if you just went a little deeper, a little further, you'd find proof, rescue, explanation. Dr. Kovak had gone looking for answers and found something that had learned to want her specifically. The missing hikers had gone looking for family and found something that could be their family's voice. I was being called to come home to something that had studied me thoroughly enough to reproduce me. The creatures were patient, and intelligent and hungry in a way that suggested they were eating something other than flesh. By mid-September, I developed a theory I couldn't prove and wouldn't report. The creatures weren't simply predators. They were parasitic. They fed on the specific thing that made isolation bearable, the human ability to recognize your own existence, to trust your sense of self. They ate identity. They left the body alive long enough to realize what had been taken, and in that realization they fed again. The thought was so dark that I had to stop myself from following it further. Because if that was true, if that was what the voices were doing to me in the long hours I spent alone, then I had perhaps a week before I forgot myself entirely. I made a decision. On September 18, I radioed the regional office and said I was coming out. I claimed exhaustion, stress-related incident. They arranged my replacement and helicopter transport for October 5. 2 weeks to close the cabin and prepare the transition. But I didn't plan to wait 2 weeks. I spent the time in preparation. I reviewed the topographical maps. I studied the trails leading out of the sector. I mapped the locations where the voices were most active, high forest zones, areas with significant geological features that might amplify and distort sound. I noted that the creatures seemed to avoid certain areas, the immediate vicinity of the cabin, zones where human activity was most concentrated, places with good visibility and limited cover. And I noticed something else. The voices were becoming more varied, more desperate. They were adapting their techniques because something about me was resisting. I wasn't following the paths they laid out. I wasn't abandoning my routine. I wasn't, despite everything, becoming lost. This made me dangerous to them, in whatever limited way something like that could be endangered. If I left the forest while still retaining some core sense of myself, I could tell people what had happened. Not in a way that would be believed. God knows I barely believed it, but in a way that might make them cautious, make them enforce the rules I'd established, make them understand that the forest at Bear Ridge was not a place for isolated individual exploration. On September 20, I heard a voice that stopped me. It was my sister's voice, Callista. She'd died 10 years ago. A car accident on the highway 200 miles from here. The last conversation we'd had was tense. I'd blown off her birthday dinner to work overtime at Yosemite. It was a wound I'd never quite closed. "Kavi, I'm here," her voice called from the forest. "I came to find you. Why did you leave? Why did you go to the forest and forget about me?" The pain was immediate and physical. Grief and guilt that I thought I'd processed years ago came back raw and specific. I found myself moving toward her voice before I caught myself. That's when I understood the final evolution of their hunting. They weren't trying to trick me anymore. They were trying to break me. They were using the architecture of my own psychology against me, finding the cracks and forcing themselves deeper. I sat in the cabin and I cried, understanding that I had perhaps hours left before I went looking for my sister in the dark. My last morning at the cabin, I prepared the official handover documentation. I cleaned the quarters thoroughly. I left detailed notes for my successor, who would be Marcus's nephew, a young ranger eager for the isolated post. I left the research notes about acoustic phenomena. I left out the journal. The journal I burned. I watched the pages curl in the fireplace, the ink blackening and disappearing, my observations of the creatures becoming ash. It felt like erasing myself, which I suppose was the point. If I denied what I'd seen, if I reduced it to psychological phenomena and acoustic tricks, maybe I could convince myself it wasn't real. The problem with that strategy is that you don't quite believe yourself. The helicopter arrived at 10 o'clock. The pilot was a professional, chatty, unconcerned. He'd picked me up dozens of times, flew rangers in and out of remote posts constantly. I secured my personal gear, clothes, gear, the basics. Everything else I left in the cabin, as per protocol. As we lifted off, I looked down at the forest. The canopy was beginning to turn gold and red at the edges as summer gave way to fall. From above, the expanse looked peaceful, almost benign. No indication of what moved through those trees. We followed the ridge line toward the airfield. The pilot was saying something about weather patterns, about how the season was shifting earlier than usual. Then I heard it, not externally, but in my ears, in my skull, in the space between thought and hearing, my sister's voice. Then Marcus's voice. Then the voice of a man I'd never met but somehow knew was Arthur Voss, the researcher from the 1970s. Then Pamela Kovak's voice. Except it sounded different now. Flattened, without affect, like a recording of a recording. Then my own voice, clear and perfect and utterly mine, saying things I had never said. "You're not leaving. This doesn't end. You took our voices and now we take yours. The forest is not a place you visit, Ranger. The forest is where visitors become residents. You'll come back. We'll call, and you'll come back. The pilot's hand was on my arm. Had been on my arm for a while, maybe. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own voice speaking from everywhere at once. I understand now that this is what happened to the ones who disappeared. Not death, not immediate harm, but a kind of translation. Their voices remained in the forest, used by something that collected human sounds the way a museum collects artifacts. The helicopter landed. I got out. A ranger supervisor asked me questions and I answered them, but I'm not entirely certain what I said. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, like something familiar trying to be me. I filed an incident report claiming psychological stress and environmental hazard. I recommended that the Bear Ridge post be closed, that future exploration of that sector be restricted to small groups in daylight hours. I didn't expect them to listen. I spent 3 weeks in a county hospital being evaluated for stress and possible stress-related delusions. The doctors were kind, they prescribed medications. They assured me that what I'd experienced was a recognized phenomenon, isolation-induced psychological stress, combined with the power of suggestion and acoustic anomalies. They released me with recommendations for continued therapy. I haven't been back to the forest, but I hear the voices. Not constantly, but at odd moments. When I'm tired or alone, when my attention is unfocused, I hear my own voice calling me. I hear Callista. I hear names of people I've never met but somehow recognize as previous residents of that sector. Sometimes I wonder if I ever actually left, if the helicopter ride was real or was another layer of the thing's hunting strategy. If I'm still in the cabin, alone with the radio, slowly forgetting who I am as something in the darkness learns to wear my voice like a skin. The new ranger, Marcus's nephew, lasted 4 months. He filed a transfer request citing acoustic anomalies and psychological pressure. I tried to call him to warn him more clearly, but he wouldn't take my calls. I've looked at the incident reports since. They're accumulating, more hikers reporting voices, more people becoming lost in the high forest despite clear trails, more rangers requesting reassignment, and I understand finally what the creatures were doing with Dr. Kovak and the others. They were collecting, building a library of voices, creating an archive of human identity that they could deploy against the next person who came into the forest looking for rescue, looking for proof, looking for anything to hold on to when the isolation became unbearable. The forest is still there. The cabin is still standing. The lake still reflects the sky at evening. And in the deep woods, something is learning to speak in voices it's stolen. It's learning to call names it should never have learned. It's building a language from the screams and desperate calls of people who trusted the forest to let them leave. If you ever hear your own voice calling to you from the dark woods, asking you to come closer, asking you to help, asking you to come home, trust me, that's not you. That's the forest. That's the cost of bearing witness to something that wears stolen voices like a hunter wears camouflage. And the forest always collects payment. Always. I accepted the position at Ravens Peak Ranger Station in late March, when the Appalachian forest still held winter in its bones. The hiring officer asked why I wanted such an isolated post, and I told him the truth. I was running from something, though not from the law. I was running from myself. My name is Keys Roan. I'd worked seasonal ranger positions across 4 states, moving on whenever a place started to feel too much like home, too much like permanence. The previous ranger at Ravens Peak had resigned abruptly in February, citing irreconcilable environmental factors. No further details were provided. When I saw the posting, something in the brief description pulled at me. 8,000 acres of protected forest. 1 ranger, 1 cabin, 1 lake fed by underground springs that kept it liquid even in the harshest winters. The cabin materialized from the fog like something half-remembered. It sat on a slight rise overlooking Raven Lake, elevated enough that floodwaters wouldn't reach it but close enough that the lake's mineral smell drifted through the windows. The structure was solid. Cinder block foundation, metal roof, replaced windows that rattled against their frames when wind pressed hard from the west. Previous rangers had left their marks in faded pencil on the walls near the kitchen table. Names, dates, single-word notations like quiet and lonely, and 1 cryptic entry from 2019 simply reading, "Hear them." The equipment I inherited was functional. A Ford Ranger truck, tire chains, radios that crackled with the kind of static that made time feel different. Maps marked with trail condition updates going back 5 years. A logbook filled with daily observations, weather, trail maintenance, wildlife sightings, visitor count. The last entry was dated February 14th. Gone, it read. That was all. The satellite phone worked. Email came through when conditions allowed. I had contact with the district office 30 miles south, though the drive took nearly 2 hours on winter roads and didn't much decrease the fundamental isolation. The nearest town was Millbrook, population 847, where supplies could be acquired from a general store that smelled of diesel and mildew. The cashier was a woman named Renee who raised her eyebrows when I introduced myself as the new ranger but didn't offer much conversation. In those first weeks, the silence was almost medicinal. I wanted silence more than I wanted company. I'd lost my daughter 5 years ago. Not to death, but to choices she made that took her away from me. The details don't matter for this account. What matters is that the silence of Raven's Peak felt like absolution. The forest in April is a different animal than the forest in March. Things wake up. The canopy fills in. Sounds that were muffled by snow suddenly travel through clear air. I began walking the trails at dawn, marking fallen limbs, checking for erosion, noting where the wood structure of the shelter boxes needed repair. The work was methodical and good. My muscles remembered the rhythm of seasonal maintenance. I fell asleep early, slept deeply. The trail maps divided the 8,000 acres into 7 main sections. Raven Lake occupied the central area, with hiking loops radiating outward. The Limestone Ridge Trail was the most popular, a 7-mile circuit with views of 3 valleys. The Deep Fork Trail was older, less maintained, descending into a ravine where a seasonal waterfall fed a creek that ultimately connected to the lake. All the trails had been walked 10,000 times. All of them were safe, or at least they were supposed to be. My first genuine act as the stationed ranger came in the last week of April, when I received a report of a missing hiker. A group of 4 had started the Limestone Ridge Loop early on a Sunday morning. 3 returned to the trailhead parking area by evening. The 4th, a 31-year-old man named Marcus Henridge from Charleston, never appeared. The district office dispatched volunteers. I coordinated with them from the station, providing copies of the map and current trail conditions. We walked the loop together, calling Henridge's name into the forest. The weather was clear. The trail was well marked. There was no logical reason for someone to become lost there. We found him the next morning sitting on a fallen oak about 200 yards from the marked trail. He was hypothermic despite the mild temperature, his lips blue, his hands shaking so severely he couldn't hold water to his lips. He'd been missing for 17 hours. The rescue team rushed him to the hospital in a neighboring county. The official report concluded that Henridge had wandered off trail, become disoriented, and settled down to wait for rescue. This happens more often than it should. People panic. They second-guess themselves. They make decisions that don't track with the reality in front of them. But when I interviewed Henridge by phone 2 days later, his account was different. He told me he'd heard voices calling him away from the trail. They sounded like hikers on other trails, he said. They sounded like people he knew. His wife's voice, his brother's voice, they kept calling until he followed them. He walked further than he realized. Then the voices stopped, and he was alone in the deepening forest, unable to find his way back. I noted this in the station log. I flagged it for the district office. The response was a polite acknowledgement, and the standard advice: post more directional markers on the popular trails. Consider implementing a mandatory check-in system for groups. I did all of that, but I also started researching what Henridge had experienced. May came with mud season. The trails became nearly impassable, churned into channels by the seasonal thaw. I worked through the trails systematically, placing water bars to redirect runoff and prevent erosion. It was the kind of work that could consume a full day with minimal thought required. It was during this maintenance work that I found the first absence. The body, or what remained of it, was on a side trail off Deep Fork, partially buried under drifted leaves and moss. The decomposition was advanced, but the jacket was recent fabric, relatively clean when I cleared the debris. The remains had been there for weeks, maybe longer. I called it in immediately. The investigation was handled by county authorities with state police involvement. The remains were identified as belonging to a missing person report filed 9 months earlier. A woman named Eleanor Cod, 54, had failed to return from a solo hiking trip in August of the previous year. Her husband had reported her missing. The search had eventually been called off. They'd held a memorial. Her husband had remarried. The official determination was that Cod had become lost, fallen, and died from injuries and exposure. The location of her remains supported this narrative, slightly off-trail, in a ravine that would be easy to tumble into if someone wasn't paying attention. But the thing that caught my attention, the detail that the investigators didn't seem to find significant, was a peculiar pattern around the remains. The moss and leaves had been arranged in a semicircular formation, as if something had been circling the body, or as if the body itself had been pulled or dragged in repetitive patterns. I asked the lead investigator about it. He shrugged. Animals, he said. Deer, raccoons, they'll drag remains around, especially if they're scavenging, possibly. But animals don't typically create patterns. They don't typically arrange things with any visible intention. June brought visitors. The weather improved to genuine warm and the hiking trails filled with people in good spirits, equipped with expensive gear and smartphone GPS units that often sent them exactly wrong. I pulled 4 people off the trails in June. None of them could quite explain how they'd become so thoroughly turned around on clearly marked paths. The incident reports piled up on my desk. I forwarded them all to the district office. The response was eventually a phone call from my supervisor, a man named Vess, who'd been overseeing ranger stations across a 6-county area for 16 years. You're generating a lot of incident traffic, he said. The trail conditions support that, I replied. The previous rangers didn't file this many reports. I wanted to ask about the previous ranger's cryptic note, about the entry dated February 14th. Instead, I said, I'm being thorough. Vess paused. Then, the locals don't like too much attention drawn to that area. Ravens Peak has a reputation. Historic disappearances, unusual incidents. It spooks people. If we generate too many official reports, we get media attention, which gets us attention, which gets the Park Service asking questions about resource allocation. So you want me to stop reporting incidents? I want you to exercise discretion. Not every confused hiker needs to become a statistic. I didn't argue, but I also didn't agree. I kept filing reports. They became more detailed. I began including my own observations, technical details about the condition of the trails, the electromagnetic properties of the area, unusual acoustic phenomena I'd noticed, how sound traveled oddly in certain ravines, how voices sometimes seemed to come from 2 places at once. It was around this time that I began hearing them too. The voices came at dusk, usually, during the hour when the light turned the forest into something between day and night. They came from the direction of the Deep Fork Trail, carrying upward through the ravine and across the lake. At first they were indistinct, distant. I'd think they were other hikers returning from the trail, calling to each other. Then I'd go outside. The parking area would be empty. The trail would be clear. And still the voices would come, calling names I almost recognized. I kept this to myself. I didn't report it. I understood that admitting to hearing voices would prompt a psychiatric evaluation and removal from my post, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I documented everything in a personal journal, separate from the official logbook. I began researching the area's history through the library system in Millbrook. The research revealed a familiar pattern. In 1987, 2 hikers had vanished from the trails, only to be found weeks later disoriented and unable to account for their time. In 2003, a ranger had abandoned his post suddenly, leaving only a note saying he'd heard the calling from the forest. In 2014, a search and rescue volunteer had gone into the woods during a training exercise and hadn't come out. His remains were found 2 years later, 7 miles from where he'd entered the forest. The newspaper archives showed other incidents from the broader region. Visitors with confused accounts of time, trail routes that seemed to reorganize themselves, and running through all of it, a thread of folklore. Local stories, passed down through families, about the creatures that live deep in the Appalachian forests, about how some hikers were chosen, about voices that mimicked the ones you loved most. The locals called them the walkers, not because they walked, but because they called, because they imitated the voices of the living and the dead to lure people away from safety. The first time one of them came to the cabin, I nearly didn't recognize the threat. It was late July. The evening was cool. The kind of cool that feels like relief after months of heat. I was on the porch, watching the lake, when I heard my mother's voice calling my name. She's been dead for 8 years. I would recognize that voice anywhere, and it carried now across the water like she was standing just beyond the tree line. Keys, she called. Keys, sweetheart, help me. I stood immediately. Every rational part of my mind understood what was happening, understood that the voice couldn't be hers, that this was the phenomenon I'd been documenting. But something deeper than rationality responded to that voice, something that still needed my mother, something that would follow her voice into the dark. I made it 10 steps from the porch before my conscious mind reasserted control. I stopped. I forced myself to stand still in the middle of the clearing. The voice continued calling, but now I could hear the wrongness in it. The phonetics were correct, but something about the inflection was off-center. It mimicked speech the way a recording played at slightly the wrong speed might mimic actual conversation. The shape stepped into the moonlight at the forest's edge. It was bipedal, roughly humanoid, but the proportions were subtly fractured. The legs seemed a half shade too long. The arms bent in one too many places. The head was roughly sphere-shaped but featureless except for two dark vertical slits where eyes should be, and it was making my mother's voice come from what should have been its mouth. I ran into the cabin and locked the door. Through the window, I watched the shape stand in the clearing for maybe 2 minutes. My mother's voice continued calling, overlaid now with other voices I recognized. My ex-wife, my daughter, my father, all of them, calling to me in subtle distress, asking for help that only I could provide. Then the shape turned and walked backward into the forest, maintaining eye contact through the dark, and vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with all the lights on, my hands shaking, trying to process what I'd seen. It was easy to construct rational explanations. A person in a costume, someone playing a psychological trick on the ranger, an elaborate hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. The human mind's remarkable capacity for pattern recognition pushed into overdrive, but I knew with a certainty that transcended rational analysis that what I'd seen wasn't human, and I knew that it would return. I radioed the district office at dawn. I told Vess that I'd had a visitor, that there had been a break-in attempt at the cabin. I didn't mention voices or strange shapes. I reported it as a possible crime and requested that a law enforcement patrol be sent to the area. It took them 3 days to arrive. 2 county deputies, bored and skeptical, who examined the cabin and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no missing items. They concluded it had probably been a black bear that I'd startled, that I should implement better food security. "You're out here alone too long," the younger deputy said, not unkindly. "It gets in your head." After they left, I made a decision. I would go into the deep forest. I would find the source of the voices. I would understand what was happening in the Ravens Peak area well enough to either prove it or disprove it in a way that wouldn't require explaining what I'd seen. I prepared methodically: GPS unit, satellite communicator, trail rations, a rifle with ammunition, proper navigation equipment, and backup maps. I filed a detailed trip plan with the district office, telling them I was conducting a comprehensive inventory of trail conditions in the Deep Fork sector. I entered the forest at dawn on the first day of August. The Deep Fork Trail descended steadily, following a creek that ran year-round. The water was clear and cold, descending in small waterfalls and pools, the sound of it steady and orienting. I marked my route carefully, aware that this trail had been the origin point for many of the strange incidents in my research. The forest here was different from the higher elevations. The canopy was denser, older. The trees seemed to have dimensions that the younger forest didn't have. Depth, history, a sense of presence that went beyond the merely biological. I heard the voices about 3 hours into the hike, and this time I forced myself to keep walking. I had my navigation systems, I had a clear objective. The voices couldn't make me lost if I refused to listen to them, but they were insistent. They called from ahead of me and behind me simultaneously. They called from the forest itself, seeming to come from no specific direction, and they were varied. Not just people I knew, voices of people I'd passed on the street once, the details lodging in my memory so deeply I'd forgotten them. Voices of hikers from incident reports I'd read. Voices that sounded like they'd been dead for decades. The trail disappeared at a certain point. There was no dramatic ending, just a gradual dissolution where the path became ambiguous and then unreliable. I noted the location on my GPS and continued on a bearing that should have kept me oriented. That's when I found the first of the structures. It was almost like a shelter, but nothing I'd seen before. Branches had been woven together in a way that suggested neither animal construction nor human intentionality. The pattern was geometric but not geometrically consistent, as if the spaces between the branches had been calculated to create a specific effect on the human eye. Inside the shelter there were objects. Hiking boots, mostly, though some shoes and a few articles of clothing. I counted 37 items, maybe more. All of them arranged with that same semicircular precision I'd noticed around Eleanor Cod's remains. My radio crackled. There was no signal this deep in the ravine, but the sound came through anyway. "Come," said a voice that sounded exactly like my daughter's voice, which I hadn't heard in 5 years. "You're so close, just a little further." I pulled out my satellite communicator and tried to send an emergency alert. The device showed the correct time but no signal. The battery was draining rapidly, even though it should have lasted 3 more days. The forest around me had taken on an increasingly dreamlike quality. The light was wrong. It was neither dawn nor dusk, but something between, like the forest existed in a perpetual threshold. The trees seemed closer together than they had moments before. The creek, which I should still be able to hear, had gone quiet. I navigated for 2 more hours using pure GPS coordinates. And then I found them. The clearing was at least an acre in size, impossibly large for a space this deep in a ravine. And it was filled with them. Dozens of the creatures, moving with that strange elongated gait, making sounds that approximated human speech. They were circling something at the center of the clearing. Something that might have once been human but had been so extensively dismantled that determining what it had been seemed impossible. I stopped breathing. I'm not being metaphorical. My lungs simply ceased functioning. I couldn't draw a breath. My vision started to narrow. I was going to die there, watching these things move through a space that shouldn't exist. Then something happened that broke the spell. One of the creatures turned and looked directly at me, and I saw for just a moment the human intelligence behind those vertical slits. Not something that was pretending to be human. Something that had once been human. Something that had been here so long it had become something else. My lungs seized and released. I gasped air into my body and ran. I ran through the forest with no regard for direction. No thought for the GPS coordinates that might have guided me back. I ran on pure animal instinct, the part of my brain that understood that continuing to be alive required immediate removal from the presence of those things. I must have run for an hour, maybe more. Time felt impossible to parse. And then I hit the creek, hitting it hard enough to knock myself into the water. The shock of the cold was absolutely clarifying. I scrambled upstream, using the flow of water as my navigation guide, understanding on some deep level that water runs downhill, and downhill meant out of the ravine. I emerged onto the Deep Fork Trail as the light was changing from day into dusk. I could see the parking area through the trees. I could see my truck. I didn't stop to rest. I drove to Millbrook, then drove further, all the way to the nearest city hospital, 60 miles away. I checked myself into the emergency department and told them I'd gotten lost hiking and experienced a panic attack. That I'd been out of my mind for some portion of the experience and might have done things I couldn't fully remember. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with me. My vitals were stable, blood work was normal. They recommended psychiatric evaluation. They suggested that isolation in my position could exacerbate mental health issues, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew what I had to do. I returned to the station after 3 days. Vess called immediately, asking about my unplanned absence. I told him I'd sustained a minor injury on the hiking inventory mission and had gone to get it checked out. It was the kind of vague answer that could mean almost nothing and could therefore be believed. I think I need to request transfer, I told him. The isolation here is affecting my judgment. I heard something that might have been relief in his voice. I can process that. There's a position opening up in the lowland park to the south. Better visibility, more day hikers, all of that. I'll write the request formally, I said. But I should probably stay on station until the transfer is processed. That's the professional thing to do. There was a pause. Yeah, that's probably right. So I stayed. And I prepared. I spent my time at the cabin consolidating what I'd learned. I reviewed my research, I organized my documentation, and I waited to see if what I'd seen in the deep forest would follow me back. It did. The first sign was subtle. My supplies began to be rearranged. My maps were moved. Small items disappeared and reappeared in different locations. The things you might dismiss as stress-induced memory lapses or simply misplacing objects. But the voices never came again. That was the interesting part. The creatures didn't try to mimic anyone close to me. They'd learned something in the forest. They understood now that I knew what they were. On the 15th day of my extended stay, I woke to find an arrangement of objects on my front porch. Hiking boots, 7 pairs of them, arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle was a map, my map, from my desk, with a location marked in the deep ravine. The location was where I'd found the clearing, and underneath the map was a name written in what I initially thought was mud but which I soon realized was something else. Something that had come from one of those creatures themselves. The name was mine. I sat on the porch for a long time, drinking coffee, watching the lake. I understood what was happening. The creatures wanted something from me. They'd marked me. In some way I couldn't fully comprehend. I was part of their process now. I'd seen them at a level that most people never reached. I'd traveled into their space and survived. That meant something to them. The question was what I should do with that knowledge. I considered my options. I could leave. I could submit the transfer request and walk away from the Ravens Peak station forever. There were probably places far enough from the Appalachian wilderness where I could live a normal life, where the forests wouldn't call to me, where I wouldn't lie awake at night knowing what existed in the spaces between the marked trails. Or I could stay. I could work here knowing what I knew. I could file the incident reports. I could guide people carefully through the trails. I could watch and document and understand, and maybe, eventually find a way to explain what was happening in a way that wouldn't make me sound like a broken person with a broken mind. The next morning I called Vess and told him I'd changed my mind. I wanted to stay at Ravens Peak. The isolation wasn't affecting me the way we'd discussed. I'd gotten properly evaluated. I was fine. I was actually starting to feel, for the first time in many years, like I'd found a place where I belonged. Vess didn't argue. It seemed like he'd expected this. Just keep the incident reports to what's relevant, he said, and try to stay safe out there. I agreed. I didn't tell him that staying safe was probably no longer an option available to me. That evening, as dusk painted the lake into bronze and shadow, I stood on the porch and called out toward the forest. I didn't use words, I just made a sound, a kind of acknowledgement, an understanding that I would stay, that I would watch, that I would bear witness to whatever was happening in the deep woods, and that I would endure it, because leaving had never actually been a choice. The forest went quiet. Even the normal evening sounds, birds, insects, wind, seemed to hold themselves still. And then, from somewhere in the ravine, I heard something that might have been the echo of my own voice, or might have been the approval of something that had been watching me since I'd first arrived at this remote station on this remote lake. I went inside and locked the door, but I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness watching the trees beyond the window, waiting for whatever would come next, because I finally understood why the previous rangers had left so quickly, and I finally understood why I could never leave. The forest doesn't release people it's chosen. It just teaches them how to live inside their own fear, how to exist in the border space between safety and the unknown, how to maintain a human shape while becoming something else entirely. My name is Keys Roan. I am the ranger at Ravens Peak, and I have learned to listen to the voices in the woods. I have learned, slowly and completely, what it means to bear witness to something that defies everything we believe to be true about the world. The thing I can't decide is whether I'm still here because I accepted this post, or whether I accepted this post because something was calling me all along. I suspect the truth is that there is no difference. The lake is calm tonight. The forest is quiet. But I can feel them out there, in the deep ravine, in the spaces between the marked trails, moving through a clearing that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, usually at dusk, I hear my mother's voice calling my name. This time I listen. This time I almost answer. But I don't. Not yet. Not while I still have the choice. The letter arrived in November, and I nearly threw it away. I was living in a studio apartment in Missoula then, working double shifts at a hardware store, living off coffee and resentment. 10 years out of college with a degree in environmental science that qualified me for nothing and everything at once. The Park Service rejection emails had stopped coming months before. I'd made peace with that failure the way you make peace with any door that refuses to open, by stopping knocking. Morgan Reeves. It began. We have reviewed your application for the winter ranger position at Glacier National Park. I read the rest standing in my kitchen with the envelope half crumpled in my hand. They wanted someone to staff the remote cabin at Lake McDonald from December through March. Alone, months of solitude in one of the most isolated regions of northern Montana. Most applicants backed out once they understood what that meant. No cell service, no reliable road access after January, a cabin with wood heat and a well you had to prime by hand. The job paid poorly and demanded everything. I accepted within 48 hours. The isolation wasn't an obstacle for me. It was the entire reason I wanted it. After a decade of watching people, of pretending to care about their tool purchases, of swallowing the acidic taste of their small talk, I needed to be alone in a way that felt less like depression and more like intention. The mountains of northern Montana offered that permission. I drove up in late November, my truck packed with everything I'd been told I'd need. The ranger station in West Glacier gave me keys, maps, and a 3-ring binder of protocols. Donna, the woman who handed them over, was in her 60s and had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades outdoors. You'll see maybe 2 people a month, she said, not looking at me while she talked. One's Jackson, the Forest Service guy who comes through to check the boundary line. The other's probably you if you decide to drive out for supplies. What about emergencies? I asked. Radio. You know how to use one? I'll learn. She nodded and didn't offer to teach me. The radio was ancient, the kind that needed to warm up for several seconds before transmitting. I'd figure it out because I had no other choice. The cabin was 7 miles from the main road, accessible by a rough logging path that turned into a hiking trail near the end. I made the drive in my truck until the ruts got too deep, then hiked the final mile with supplies strapped to my back. It was late afternoon when I first saw the structure. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Logs weathered gray, a metal roof partially covered in pine needles, a covered porch facing the lake. The previous ranger had left it clean. The interior smelled of wood ash and old coffee. There was a kitchen set up with a cast iron stove, a small bedroom with a cot, a main room with a desk and a chair facing the window. That window looked directly across Lake McDonald, toward the mountains beyond. The first week, I believed I'd made a terrible mistake. The silence was different than I'd anticipated. I'd expected peace. What I got was weight, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. At night, the dark was absolute. I'd grown up with streetlights and traffic sounds. Out here, the world simply stopped producing noise, and my mind started producing it instead. Creaking boards, wind that sounded like something moving through the trees, the lake lapping against the shore in patterns that almost seemed intentional. By the second week, I'd adjusted. I established routines. Morning coffee made on the stove, checking the perimeter of the cabin and the nearby trail. Afternoon light was precious in winter, so I'd spend it outside, often walking to the north shore of the lake where the mountains rose up like cathedral walls. I'd brought books, but I found I didn't read much. Mostly I sat and watched the light change, watched the lake, watched the mountains shift through different shades of blue and gray. It was good. It was what I needed. Then, on December 15th, I heard the voice. The radio crackled that morning. Jackson checking in, asking if everything was fine at the cabin. I confirmed it was. His voice was distant and professional, the way Ranger communications always were. I'd been practicing the protocol for 2 weeks, and by then it felt natural. That evening, I heard something else. I was inside, heating soup on the stove, when I heard what sounded like someone calling from the woods. Not a voice, exactly. Something between a voice and an animal sound, pitched too high and too low at the same time, carrying across the water in that strange way sounds do when they bounce off frozen ground and snow. I went to the window. The lake was white now, covered in the early ice of winter. The far shore was completely dark, the mountains just visible as darker shapes against a dark sky. Nothing moved. The sound came again. It was unmistakably calling. Not words exactly, but the cadence of a human voice shaped into a call. Hello? Something like that, the vowel drawn out, almost musical. It seemed to come from the southwest, somewhere in the pine forest between my cabin and the main trail. I considered ignoring it. Everything I'd been told about solo ranger work involved a basic principle: respond to no voices you can't identify. Sound carries strangely in winter, sounds deceive. Hunters sometimes came through this area illegally, and they could be dangerous if startled. But it came again. Hello-o, hello-o? Like someone looking for an answer. I pulled on my coat and grabbed the flashlight from the porch hook. Outside, the temperature was close to 0. The snow crunched under my boots, loud in the stillness. I walked toward the sound, keeping to the tree line, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Hello? I called back. This is Park Service. Identify yourself. The sound stopped. I waited for 5 minutes, maybe longer, standing at the edge of the clearing with my flashlight making circles in the snow. Nothing answered, no movement in the trees, no lights from another cabin or camp. The forest was absolutely still in the way that only forests in deep winter can be still. Not peaceful, but oppressive, like everything was holding its breath. I went back inside and didn't mention it in the log. Over the next week, I heard the sound perhaps 5 more times. Always in the evening, always from somewhere west of the cabin. Always stopping as soon as I acknowledged it. I never saw anything. I never found tracks, though the snow was often too crusty to show clear prints. Once I hiked out nearly a mile in the direction of the sound and found nothing. No cabin, no camp, no sign that anything had been there recently. Jackson came through on December 22nd. He was a man in his 50s, muscular in a way that spoke of practical work rather than gym time. He spent 40 minutes checking the boundary markers and then came by the cabin for coffee. "Hear anything unusual?" he asked. It was his standard question. "Some animals," I said. "Sounds carrying across the water," he nodded. "This area gets elk herds. They make all kinds of noise. Bugle in the fall, but they call year-round sometimes. Sounds like almost anything if you're not used to it. He left before dark, and I didn't tell him about the voice. I wasn't sure why. Partly because I couldn't articulate what exactly I'd heard. Partly because I was ashamed at how much it had bothered me. And partly because some small, careful part of my mind was already wondering if Jackson would tell Donna that I was having trouble with the isolation and then the job would be taken away. The sounds continued through the last week of December. The voice calling, always from the same general direction, always stopping when I responded. I started to establish a pattern. I would hear it at dusk, roughly 30 minutes after the sun went down. It would call perhaps 3 times. Then silence. I told myself it was likely a hunter, or someone living in the area I didn't know about, or an animal mimicking sounds in a way that pricked at human recognition. My brain was primed to hear voices. I'd been alone for a month. Of course I was starting to hear voices, but underneath that rational explanation, something else was forming, a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to attention, the sense that I was being noticed. On December 29th, Christmas had passed quietly. I'd made myself a decent dinner and sat looking at the mountains. I was cleaning out the ash from the stove when I noticed something on the porch, a piece of fabric. Red, about the size of my hand, caught between the boards near the door. I picked it up carefully. It was old, sun-bleached and stained. The fibers were synthetic, the kind of material you'd find on a hiking jacket from 10 or 15 years ago. It looked like it had been outside for a very long time, weathered by multiple seasons. I stood holding it for several minutes, trying to remember if I'd seen it when I first arrived. I'd swept the porch that first day. Had it been there then? There was no way to know. I put it in the woodpile, not at the cabin, but back in the forest, 50 yards away. A small test, a way to see if it had been placed there intentionally, or if it was just debris the wind had gathered. The next morning, the fabric was on my porch again, same location, same position, as if it had never been moved. I picked it up, walked it half a mile into the forest, and left it wedged in the crook of a tree branch. I marked the location in my mind, a tall pine with a distinctive shape. 36 hours later, it was back on my porch. I stopped sleeping well, not from nightmares but from a state of half-consciousness that kept me aware of every sound. I'd lie on my cot listening to the cabin settle, distinguishing between normal creaking and something else. The wind had its particular voices, one for the front of the cabin, another for the back. Rain, when it came, produced a specific percussion on the metal roof. I learned these sounds the way a sailor learns the voice of his ship. Everything else I treated as unusual. The voice came every night now, sometimes twice. It wasn't improving or becoming clearer. If anything, it was becoming more varied. Sometimes it sounded almost like it was forming words. Sometimes it sounded less human, more like wind through a throat. I stopped responding to it. I found that ignoring it was the only way to keep my mind functioning, to maintain the separation between the world and my interpretation of it. I radioed Donna on January 4th. "Everything all right out there?" she asked. "Fine, just checking in. Supplies are good. Cabin's holding up well. See anyone? Jackson came through last week. Good. Radio if you need anything." I wanted to ask her if anyone else was supposed to be in the area. I wanted to ask about the fabric. I wanted to ask if other rangers who'd worked the winter position had heard strange things. I said none of these things. Instead, I said goodbye and switched off the radio. That night, I heard something different. It wasn't the voice. It was the sound of something moving through the snow outside the cabin. Not an animal gait. Something walking on 2 legs, heavy, with long pauses between steps. I heard it circle the cabin, moving from the west side around to the north. It moved slowly, as if examining the structure. I sat on my cot, fully dressed, fully awake, listening to it move. The sound stopped near the window of my bedroom, the one that faced the forest. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then the sound resumed and moved away, toward the lake. I didn't go outside. The next morning, I checked the perimeter. There were no tracks. The snow had blown in patches, but there were sections where any footprint would have shown clearly. I found nothing. Over the next 10 days, I heard the movement 4 more times. Always at night, always circling the cabin in that slow, measured way. Once, I heard it try the door, not pushing hard, but testing it the way someone might check if something was locked. The handle rattled slightly. I'd installed a simple bolt lock on the inside after the first time, though I hadn't acknowledged to myself why. The voice continued its evening calls. The fabric reappeared on my porch twice more, even after I burned it the second time. The third time, I found it in a different location, draped over the latch of the shed where I kept firewood. I was operating on almost no sleep. I'd developed a routine where I'd read by lamplight until midnight, then try to rest for 4 hours before waking and building the fire at 4 a.m. The rest of the day I spent in a state of tired clarity that felt somehow appropriate to the situation. On January 15th, it was cold enough that the lake froze completely. The surface became hard, reflective, a sheet of white that extended from my shore all the way to the mountains. That same day I noticed something odd in the snow on the lake, roughly 100 yards from my cabin. A pattern. Not a track exactly, but a series of marks that created a deliberate formation. From a distance it looked almost like a spiral. I hiked out across the ice to examine it more closely, though every step felt like a terrible decision. The marks were gouges in the snow, as if something had dragged across the surface. They formed a rough circular path, large enough that it took me a minute to walk from one side to the other. In the center there was a deeper disturbance, a hole roughly the size of a human hand, surrounded by what looked like scratched or scraped ice. I stood there for a long time, not touching anything, trying to construct an explanation. Wind patterns. Ice forming irregularly, a seal or some other creature testing the ice, but the hole was too precise, and the circular marks were too deliberate. I walked back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day hauling firewood, working until my body hurt too much to think. That evening I did something I'd been avoiding. I opened the 3-ring binder that Donna had given me and looked through the previous ranger logs. The previous ranger was someone named Kemp. He'd written minimal notes. All clear, supplies adequate. Weather reports snow. His entries were sparse, almost professional in their refusal to acknowledge anything beyond the basic requirements. Then, in February of the previous year, the tone changed. Sounds in the forest west of cabin. Likely hunter but will monitor. Continued sounds. Investigating tomorrow. No evidence found. Recheck tomorrow. Investigation inconclusive. Sound appears to be animal, possibly elk, and then nothing. The next entry was written by someone else, a ranger named Davies, who took over on March 1st with a note. Kemp transferred to White Pass Station due to family emergency. The handwriting in the log was shaky. Kemp's final entries showed pressure on the pen, letters that almost tore the paper. I read those entries twice, 3 times. Then I closed the binder and didn't open it again. January 28th was clear and brutally cold. Temperature was dropping toward 20 below. I'd spent the day preparing, extra firewood stacked, supplies organized, radio batteries fresh. I was trying to be methodical, trying to maintain the framework of normal routine. That evening, I made myself dinner and sat by the window as darkness fell. The lake was now a smooth expanse of pure white, the mountains beyond it barely visible in the last light. The sky was turning that particular shade of deep blue that only happens on clear winter nights when the air is dry and thin. The voice came at dusk, as it always did. Hello, multiple times from several directions at once, as if it was calling from more than one location. I didn't respond. Around 10 p.m. I heard the movement in the snow. This time it didn't circle the cabin. It came straight up the path from the lake, slow and deliberate, toward the front door, the sound of feet breaking through the crust of old snow, the particular drag and pause that had become so familiar. I was sitting in the dark, the fire in the stove low, just enough light to see the room. My hands were steady, which surprised me. My heart was beating, but it felt separate from my consciousness, something happening to my body while my mind observed it dispassionately. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Then came the sound that changed everything. It was knocking. 3 clear, deliberate knocks against the wooden door. The sound of knuckles, or something very much like knuckles, striking wood. And then a voice. Not the previous calling voice, but something closer to human speech. Muffled slightly by the door, but unmistakably articulate. Hey. Not a question. Not a greeting. Just the word. Hey. I stood up. I walked to the door. Who is it? My voice sounded different to myself. Smaller. Need help. 2 words, clearly spoken. Lost. Need help. Something in my chest started vibrating. Not my heart. Something deeper. Something responding to a truth I'd been avoiding. Where are you from? I asked through the door. Lost. Need help. Same intonation. Exactly the same. What's your name? Need help. Need help. Need help. It was repeating. Repetition was different from variation. A human who'd heard that question would have varied their response, would have shown the flexibility of actual thought. This was recitation. This was something that had learned the sounds of human speech but not the logic behind them. I didn't open the door. "There's no help available tonight," I said. "Come back when the sun is up. There's a ranger station 7 miles from here." Sun. Up. The words were separated slightly, as if being tested. "Help. Sun. Up." I didn't respond. I stood absolutely still, my hand on the interior bolt, listening. The knocking came again, but harder this time. Not the sound of a person requesting entry, but testing the structural integrity of the door. 3 blows, methodical and strong. Then silence. I heard the sound of something moving around the cabin again. But this time it wasn't slow. This time it was searching, moving from one window to another, testing each one. The living room window, the kitchen window, the bedroom window where the glass was slightly loose. I moved to the bedroom and tightened the frame from the inside, using a piece of wood I'd kept for exactly this purpose, though I hadn't admitted I was keeping it for this. The pressure on the window stopped. Then I heard something worse. I heard breathing. Close to the window. Not human breathing, but similar enough. A rhythm that indicated lungs and intention, positioned directly on the other side of the glass. I stood absolutely still. The breathing continued for nearly a minute, then it moved away. For the next hour, I listened to it explore the perimeter of the cabin, testing everything that could be tested. The windows, the door, the gaps where the walls met the porch. It moved with terrible patience, as if it had all night, as if failure was just another attempt. Around midnight it seemed to withdraw. I heard the sound moving back toward the lake, the crunching in the snow growing more distant. But I didn't believe it was leaving. I believed it was circling wider, repositioning. I packed a bag, just supplies, nothing sentimental. Matches, food that didn't require cooking, a knife, the flashlight, the radio. I opened the radio carefully and set it to the emergency channel. "This is Winter Ranger at Lake McDonald Cabin. I'm evacuating. I have reason to believe." I stopped, trying to find words that didn't sound insane. "I have reason to believe there's an unknown individual in the area who may be dangerous." Static. Then Donna's voice, slightly distorted but clear. "Lake McDonald Cabin. This is West Glacier Station. What is your situation?" "There's someone outside the cabin. I don't know who. They've been circling the building. They tried to enter. I'm going to hike out." "What's your exact situation? Are you injured?" "No. Not injured. I'm okay. But I need to leave." "Can you describe the person?" I looked toward the window. Nothing visible but the dark reflection of my own face. "I can't. It's too dark. But Donna, something is wrong here. This isn't normal." A long pause. "All right. If you're uncomfortable, you should leave. Jackson is 5 miles south of your position near the boundary line. Head in that direction if you can. I'll have him meet you." Jackson was within reach. That changed something. The situation became less abstract. There was a destination, another person, a path that led out of this. "Okay? I'm going." "Wait, one more thing. Look outside first. Make sure your path is clear." I did. I went to the window and looked out across the lake toward the forest where the boundary markers were. Clear. The snow was untouched in that direction, the moon bright enough now that I could see the ice clearly. I left the cabin without looking back. The cold was immediate and absolute. 30 below, maybe colder with the wind off the lake. My breath froze before leaving my face. The sound of my boots on the ice was too loud, too far-reaching. I kept the flashlight off, using the moonlight instead. The lake stretched ahead of me, longer than it looked from the cabin. It took 20 minutes to cross it, my focus entirely on not falling, on moving in the direction of the boundary line. I was halfway across when I heard the sounds begin again. Multiple sources. Coming from the edges of the lake, from the forest on both sides, the voice calling, multiple overlapping versions of it, almost musical in their variation. And underneath it, the heavy footfalls, crunching in the snow beyond the tree line, moving parallel to my path. I didn't run. Running on ice at night would end with a broken leg. Instead, I walked faster, my heart trying to escape through my chest. Everything in me screaming to move, to flee, to do anything except continue at this steady pace. The sounds got closer. Not on the ice with me, but circling. On both shores now. The voice was clearer, sharper. It wasn't calling anymore. It was mimicking my footsteps, step for step, almost keeping pace. I kept walking. Then I saw Jackson's light in the distance, the beam of a flashlight from somewhere near the tree line ahead of me. He was standing at the edge of the ice, and he was waving. "Keep going," he shouted. "Just keep moving." I was 100 yards from the shore when the sound stopped. All of them. The voice, the footsteps, everything. Just silence, and my own breathing, and the sound of the ice under my boots. I covered the last distance in a kind of daze, and Jackson grabbed my arm and pulled me up onto the snow. I don't remember speaking to him. I remember being in a truck, shaking so badly I couldn't hold myself upright. Jackson's hand on my shoulder, his voice doing something with words that I wasn't processing. Then I was somewhere warm. The ranger station filed a report. Law enforcement was contacted. A team went to the cabin and found nothing. No tracks, no evidence of entry attempts, no fabric, no signs of disturbance beyond the normal wear that any structure shows. They interviewed me for 3 hours. I described what I'd heard. They took notes and exchanged glances that I recognized. The kind of glances professionals exchange when someone is describing something that probably didn't happen. Jackson told them he'd never seen tracks, never heard any unusual sounds. He said the area around the cabin was clean. He said he'd responded to my emergency call immediately, and during the drive he'd seen nothing unusual. They weren't hostile about it. They were kind, actually. They suggested that the isolation, the cold, the long nights might have produced a stress response. They offered resources. They asked if I'd experienced something similar before. I told them no. I told them I didn't know what had happened. The most honest thing I said during the entire interview. I was removed from the position. Not punished, but reassigned to the West Glacier Station, working regular hours, living in a small house with other Park Service employees. The cabin remained empty through the rest of the winter. In March, Donna asked if I wanted to go back out for the final month of the position. I said no. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop in West Glacier, across from Jackson. I've worked in these mountains for 30 years, he said. He was stirring his coffee but not drinking it. I've heard things, strange things. Things I don't report because I know how it sounds. I didn't respond. That cabin sits on something. I don't know what. But Kemp wasn't the only ranger who left early. There were 3 others before him, and one ranger in the 80s who just vanished. They found him dead, 2 miles from the cabin, no clear cause. Why wasn't I told? My voice was flat, because then no one would take the job, and that cabin needs to be monitored. It's remote. People hike past it. It needs a presence there. I was quiet for a long time. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding. What is it? I don't know, Jackson said. I know it mimics things, voices, sounds, patterns of behavior. I know it's aware, I know it learns, and I know it doesn't hurt people directly. You're still here. Kemp was still here. Whatever it is, it seems to be more interested in understanding humans than harming them. That doesn't make it less terrifying, I said. No, Jackson agreed. It doesn't. I finished the season. I quit the Park Service in April. I took a job in Kalispell, managing an outdoor equipment store, and I've lived in town for the years since. Sometimes I see mountains from windows. Glacier Peak is visible from parts of the city, that tall triangle of white against the sky. When I see it, I think about the cabin at Lake McDonald. I think about the fabric, appearing and reappearing. I think about the voice that learned human speech, the footsteps that circled slowly, the breathing against the window. I think about Jackson's phrase, it seems to be more interested in understanding humans than harming them. I didn't accept the job in that wilderness because I wanted to be alone. I know that now, the way you know things in retrospect with absolute clarity. I accepted it because some part of me was broken in a way that matched that place. Broken and calling. The way only broken things can call to other broken things. The lake still exists. The cabin still exists. On winter nights when the wind is particularly cold, I wonder if something is still there, still learning, still listening for voices to echo back. The job taught me what I needed to know, not about the mountains or the wilderness, about what happens when you go looking for silence and find, instead, something that has learned to speak your language just well enough to make you wonder if you were ever truly alone. I took the position because I wanted to disappear. I survived it because I learned the difference between disappearing and being found. Sometimes I think that's the real horror of that winter. Not the unknown presence that circled the cabin, but the possibility that it was never truly hunting me at all. It was only trying to remember what it meant to be human, and it learned by listening to my fear, by studying how humans sound when they're alone, by understanding, through repetition and observation, the specific frequency of terror that humans emit. And once it learned that, once it truly understood the voice of isolation and dread, it had no further use for me. The silence that follows understanding is different than the silence before. It's the silence of something satisfied. My name is Jedediah Kessler, and I've been a ranger for 12 years across 3 different forests. But Appalachian National couldn't find anyone else desperate enough to take the position at Hollow Creek Station in late September. The pay was 40% above standard. That should have told me something. I took the job because my wife left. Not because I'm broken, because I'm practical. A failed marriage means child support, medical payments, and the small cabin I'd bought in Kentucky became a financial anchor. My previous district in Great Smoky Mountains went through layoffs. The position opened up suddenly at Appalachian, one of the most remote ranger stations in the eastern United States, carved into a narrow valley where the Appalachian Ridge system folded in on itself like it was trying to hide something. The hiring manager, Victoria Pierce, explained the situation with the tone of someone reading insurance clauses. Hollow Creek had lost 2 rangers in the past 3 years. One requested transfer after 8 months. The other, Marcus Hendricks, simply didn't come back one morning in March. They found his truck still parked at the station. "We assume he walked out," Victoria had said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Hike to the main road. It's rough terrain out there. Some people can't handle the isolation." But his personal effects were still in the cabin. His daughter called repeatedly for months, Victoria mentioned. No one had an explanation. I asked what made the position difficult. She hesitated. That hesitation cost me. "There's a section of the forest between Eagle Ridge and the Collector Creek drainage," she said finally. "We've had unusual incident reports, animal attacks mostly, livestock from nearby properties going missing, a few hikers over the years with injuries they couldn't quite explain. Nothing we've been able to prove connects to the station or the ranger. But the previous ranger spent a lot of time in his cabin toward the end. I should have pushed harder, should have asked what unusual incident reports meant specifically, should have requested the files on those hikers. Instead, I signed the contract and moved into that cabin on September 15th. The cabin sits on a rise above Hollow Creek itself, a cold stream that moves more like groundwater finding the path of least resistance than like flowing water. The structure is solid, built in the 1970s, maintained well enough. Solar panels on the roof. A generator in the shed. A radio that reaches the main station 30 miles south, though the signal breaks up if weather moves in. The nearest town is Millbrook, 23 miles away on a winding mountain road that closes half the year. My first week, I explored the district. 12,000 acres of designated forest under my watch. Rhododendron thickets so dense you can barely move through them. Hemlock stands where the canopy gets so thick that noon looks like dusk. The eastern ridge of the Appalachian Plateau, where the mountain system's oldest bones push up through the soil. The locals in Millbrook had their own ways of sizing me up. The diner owner, Rosalie, was direct. "You'll want to stay out of the collector drainage," she said while pouring my coffee. "Everything south of Eagle Ridge." "Why's that?" I asked. "Animals act strange down there," she said. "And hikers don't." "Hikers don't what?" "Act strange. They act gone." I laughed. She didn't. On my 4th day, someone was waiting for me at the cabin. A woman in her 50s with the weathered face of someone who spent decades outdoors. Her name was Julia Voss. She'd been reporting missing livestock in the surrounding area for 2 years. "The Forest Service won't do anything," she said. She owned a small farm on the northwestern boundary, near the Eagle Ridge access point. "Your predecessor wouldn't even come look at the sites. I found him out here once, near the creek, just standing in the trees like he was listening to something. When I called out, he almost jumped off a cliff." I took her seriously. I drove the 4-wheel drive truck out to her property that afternoon and examined where she'd lost 3 goats and 2 sheep in the past 18 months. What I found didn't match any animal attack I documented in my career. The kills weren't consumed. The animals looked like they'd been handled. Their bones were broken in systematic ways. One goat had its jaw dislocated cleanly, as if something had placed its hands on either side of the head and twisted with purposeful pressure. No predator works that way. Not bears, not coyotes, not any animal I could explain. "What do you think did this?" Julia asked. "I'm not sure," I told her. That night, I sat in the cabin and started going through the old logs from my predecessor. Marcus had kept notes in a paper logbook. 3 years of entries. For the first year and a half, they were standard. Trail maintenance, equipment repairs, noise complaints from the Voss property. Then, in January of that year, the tone changed. "Heard something near Collector Creek tonight. Could have been an animal moving in the brush. But the sound was wrong. Too deliberate. Too like something walking on 2 legs but not quite right." February. "Found tracks near the creek drainage. Human-sized, but the gait is off. The step length is impossible. Whatever made them was covering 6 feet of ground between prints." March. The final entries. It's learning where I am. I think it's learning my patterns. I see it sometimes, at the edge of the woods, but when I look directly, there's nothing there, just trees, just the sound of water. But the creek has started to smell different, metallic, like something upstream is. That was the last entry. March 11th. I checked the date. He disappeared on March 12th. I sat at that table for hours, the cabin creaking around me as the temperature dropped with the setting sun. The heating system kicked on with a metallic groan. Outside, the forest had gone dark, the kind of dark that exists nowhere else, where light doesn't reach at all. I told myself I was going to call Victoria the next morning. Tell her the job wasn't for me. Tell her I'd come back to Kentucky and find work somewhere else. But something about reading Marcus's deterioration, something about those words on paper, they'd gotten under my skin. I wanted to understand what he'd experienced. I wanted to know if he'd really walked out or if something had taken him into that forest and left his truck behind as a kind of joke. I was still wrong about what I was walking into, but I was finally taking it seriously. The first 2 weeks of October brought cold temperatures and clear skies, the kind of late autumn weather that makes you believe the mountains exist to show off their geometry. The rhododendrons had gone bronze. The hemlock forests looked almost black against the pale sky. I established my routine. Morning patrols checking the access roads, afternoon office work in the cabin, entering data, filing incident reports, analyzing which areas needed trail maintenance. Evenings I spent reviewing the previous logs and getting to know the district boundaries. I stayed away from the Collector Creek drainage, on purpose. I told myself I was just prioritizing other sections of the forest. But the truth was simpler. Reading Marcus's final entries had created a kind of dread that I associated with that specific location. My brain was warning me away, and for once I was listening. Julia Voss called on the 18th. Another animal missing. This time not from her farm but from a property 2 miles east, belonging to someone named Vincent Cordova. They found one of his dogs dead this time, a large German shepherd. It was hung from the branch of an oak tree about 15 feet off the ground. Not caught in branches. Not wedged. Hung. I drove out immediately. By the time I arrived, Vincent and Julia had already taken the dog down. But I examined the branch. The bark was damaged in specific locations, 4 points of contact where something with significant grip strength had pressed down, and there were scratches on the tree trunk below, as if something had climbed it with deliberate care. "This isn't a bear," Vincent said. He was younger than Julia, maybe late 40s, with the kind of build that comes from manual work. His face was pale. "Bears they don't do this." "I'll document it," I said. "File a report with the Forest Service." But we all knew that report would go nowhere. Victoria had made it clear that incident documentation was a formality, not a mechanism for investigation. These were rural property owners in an area that predators naturally passed through. Incidents were expected. What wasn't expected was the pattern. The hanging made me finally examine the one thing I'd been avoiding. The missing livestock, the injuries to Julia's animals, Marcus's final entries. They all centered on the Collector Creek drainage. The location on the district map began to feel like a nerve. On October 22nd, I drove to the Eagle Ridge trailhead. I left my truck parked at the public access point and hiked south into the collector drainage. The forest changed as I descended. The hemlock became thicker, more oppressive. The understory of rhododendrons and mountain laurel gave way to something denser, a tangle of vegetation that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. The air developed a quality I couldn't name, not exactly smell, but a thickness in the atmosphere, something that made breathing require a slight increase in effort. The Collector Creek itself came into view after 40 minutes of hiking. I'd expected it to be a normal mountain stream, fast-moving, clear, with a bed of slate-colored stones. What I found was different. The water moved slowly, too slowly for the gradient of the land. It looked stagnant despite technically flowing. The color was wrong, too. Not the crystalline blue of mountain water, but something darker, with a faint metallic cast that made me think of dissolved minerals, though I couldn't explain why my brain interpreted it as threatening. I walked the creek bed for another hour, moving upstream. The forest was growing darker with each step, even though the sky above remained clear. It was as if the canopy was becoming denser, but every time I looked up it appeared normal. That's when I found the bones. They were scattered across a clearing where the creek widened slightly, forming what might have been a pool in another season. These were old. I could tell that immediately. The white had taken on a grayish cast. The marrow had long since dried, but there were a lot of them. Too many for a single animal. I recognized deer bones. Elk bones, definitely. some smaller things that might have been raccoon or fox, and then I found one that made me stop moving. A human femur, curved and thick, definitely human, definitely adult. And beside it, as if placed carefully, a human skull with the jaw still hinged but separate from the cranium. I photographed everything, took measurements. My ranger training kicked in, a part of my brain insisting on procedure while the rest of me was working through implications. These bones had been here for years, multiple sets actually, the remains of more than one person scattered across the pool clearing like offerings. The sun was beginning to move lower in the sky. I marked the location on my GPS and decided to leave, to return with proper documentation equipment and backup. As I was turning to head back down the creek, I heard something. It sounded like someone calling. Not words, just a sound, almost like a human voice carried through water, distorted and thin. It came from deeper in the forest, from the direction I hadn't yet explored. I should have left then. Instead, I moved toward it. The sound stopped. I pushed deeper into the rhododendron thickets, following no trail, just pushing through branches that had been there undisturbed for so long they moved with the stiffness of dead things. The forest was changing again. The light filtering through the canopy had taken on a quality that made my depth perception uncertain. That's when I saw it, not clearly, not in a way I could describe to someone and have them understand, but there was a shape in the trees about 30 yards away, partially obscured by a hemlock trunk. It was roughly human-shaped, but the proportions were slightly wrong. The limbs seemed too long, or too thin, or the angles between joints suggested something that wasn't quite right. It wasn't moving, just standing there like it was waiting for me to process what I was seeing. I blinked. The shape was gone. My heart had moved into my throat. I turned and walked back toward the creek quickly, then faster. I didn't run. Some instinct told me that running would trigger pursuit, would change whatever we were doing into something more active, more predatory. Instead, I maintained a steady pace, navigating back toward the trail by dead reckoning, not looking over my shoulder. It took me 90 minutes to get back to my truck. It should have taken 40. When I reached the vehicle, I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before I felt capable of operating the manual transmission. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't grip the steering wheel. That night, I called Victoria. I told her about the bones. I expected skepticism. What I got was silence. "Document it," she said finally. "But don't go back into that area alone. That's not a requirement of your position. There are human remains down there. If that's true, then we'll coordinate with county law enforcement." "But Jed, listen to me. Marcus documented similar findings, multiple times. The investigations turned up nothing. No missing persons reports that matched. No confirmation of anything." "The bones are real," I said. "I believe you," she said. And I heard in her voice that she did. But real isn't the same as explainable. After I hung up, I sat in the dark cabin and read through Marcus's entire log again. I'd missed something before. There was a phrase that appeared repeatedly in his final months. Something he mentioned again and again. "The creek is learning." He'd written it 7 times. The creek is learning. It uses the creek. It smells like the creek. The creek is calling. Only now did I understand he wasn't being metaphorical. He'd encountered something that existed in relation to that water. Something that had boundaries and preferences and patterns. The Collector Creek wasn't the danger, it was the territory. By the time I reported the bones to County Dispatch, October had moved into its final week. The weather was deteriorating. Warm days followed by nights when frost made the cabin windows ice over. The forest was changing color in ways that made it look increasingly alien, all the warmth draining out of the earth. 2 deputies came out and hiked to the clearing. They photographed the bones and collected samples, treating it like evidence even though it was clear they didn't expect to find anything useful. The remains were too old, no cause of death evident from the bones themselves, no obvious signs of foul play that would indicate murder rather than accident or natural death. They left the following morning. No calls after that. I was beginning to understand why Marcus had stopped reporting. What I was experiencing in those final days of October was a kind of slow dissolution of normalcy. The cabin that had felt protective began to feel like a hiding place. The forest around it didn't feel like my territory to patrol. It felt like I was the one being observed from the places where the trees grew too close, where the shadows held shapes that seemed to anticipate my movements. On October 26th, I was filling the water tank outside the cabin when I noticed something floating in the cistern itself. A feather, but not from any bird I could identify. It was almost a foot long, dark gray, with a texture that looked almost like fur. I threw it away and drained the tank completely, refilled it, and told myself not to be paranoid. 3 days later, Julia called. She was frightened now in a way she hadn't been before, her voice higher, faster. "There's someone in our property," she said. Or something. "Last night I heard it walking around the house. On the roof. It was walking on the roof, Jed. I could hear the nails moving, the wood creaking. I have a gun, and I got it loaded, and I was sitting in my bedroom just listening to it walk circles around the house for hours." "Did you see it?" "No. When I looked out the windows there was nothing. But I could hear it. The weight on the roof, the rhythm of it moving. It wasn't random. It wasn't a raccoon or something. It was deliberate, learning the shape of the house." I drove to her farm immediately. It was 3 p.m., full daylight, and the place looked peaceful. But Julia's face when she answered the door was something I'd see in my memory for years afterward. The face of someone who'd understood that normal safety rules didn't apply anymore. I examined the roof. There were marks, definitely. Scratches in the thin layer of moss and lichen that covered the shingles. Deliberate marks, 5-fingered and pressed deep. Something with significant strength had walked the perimeter of her roof, probably multiple times given the wear pattern. "It's going to come back," Julia said from behind me. "It's going to keep coming back. And one night, I won't be awake." I told her to consider staying with Vincent or leaving the property temporarily. She refused. This was her home. She wasn't going to abandon it. That night, I made a decision that would define the next phase. I decided to stake out the creek drainage. Not at the clearing with the bones, but at the main branch where the 3 tributaries met, a location from Marcus's logs where he documented activity multiple times. If something was operating out of that area, if there was a pattern to when it moved and where it went, I could possibly intercept it. I'm trained in field observation. 12 years of ranger work means understanding how to track, how to move through forest without being detected, how to identify behavioral patterns. I packed a thermal camera, binoculars, a satellite communicator, and a Glock 19. I knew intellectually that a gun probably wouldn't help, but it helped me feel less like prey. I established an observation point on a ridge overlooking the tributary junction. The location gave me sightlines into the clearing below while keeping me elevated, theoretically less vulnerable. I positioned myself at 6 p.m., as the light was beginning to fade. The wait was long, the cold deepened, my breath began to fog. Around 10 p.m., the half-moon rose and cast the forest in a kind of false daylight, the shadows becoming sharp and geometric. That's when I heard it, a voice. Definitely a voice, and definitely coming from the forest below. It was calling something, a word maybe, or a name. But the sound was layered, as if multiple voices were producing it at slightly different frequencies, creating an effect that made my ear canals itch. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was unmistakable. It was calling for something, or calling to something. The thermal camera showed nothing. The forest below was normal, ambient temperature, no heat signatures that didn't match normal wildlife. Then the voice changed. It became higher, almost childlike. It was calling my name. "Jedediah," it said in a voice that almost sounded like Julia Voss. "Jedediah, come down." My stomach tightened. I kept the thermal camera focused on the area where the sound seemed to originate, but the device showed nothing. Just cold forest. "I need help," the voice continued, still using Julia's inflection. "I'm lost. I came looking for you and I got turned around." I didn't move. I didn't respond. The voice changed again. This time it sounded like Marcus Hendricks. I'd never heard Marcus speak, but something in my hindbrain recognized it as him anyway, a tone and cadence that resonated with information I didn't know I possessed. "Don't fight it," the Marcus voice said. "You're already in its territory. You've been in its territory since you arrived. There's no leaving that." I packed up my equipment and hiked out immediately. The moonlit forest suddenly felt like it was closing in from all sides, the trees becoming walls, the shadows developing depth I couldn't measure. I didn't go directly back to the cabin. I went to my truck first, then drove to a motel in Millbrook, renting a room I didn't need, just needing to exist somewhere with other people. With electrical lights and climate control and the sounds of a human town outside. I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair by the window, thermal camera in my lap, and I thought about what was happening in the forest I was supposed to be protecting. In the morning, I called Julia. She answered immediately, and I heard fear in her voice before she even spoke. "It was inside the house," she said. "Last night I woke up and it was inside the house. I could hear it moving through the kitchen, moving things, my pans, my silverware. It was arranging them, putting them in patterns." "Are you hurt?" "No. It didn't try to hurt me. It was organizing. It was understanding the space. But Jed, when I came downstairs with the gun, there was nothing there, but everything on my kitchen counter had been moved. Everything, arranged in lines. I told her to drive to Millbrook, to stay in town, to call the police if she felt threatened, to not go back to her house alone. "You're scared," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, what is it? What's doing this?" "I don't know," I told her. And that was the truth. I didn't know. I still don't. By November, I'd compiled a theory. It wasn't satisfactory, but it was the only framework that held the observations together. Something was occurring in the Collector Creek drainage that created a mechanism for localized environmental distortion. Not rational, not explainable by standard wildlife biology, but observable, documentable, repeatable. The creature or entity that I'd glimpsed in the forest near the bones. The shape that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. I came to think of it as something that existed in a state between states. It could move through the forest and produce sounds that mimicked human speech. It could learn patterns and behaviors by observation. It could manipulate objects with intentional purpose. Most importantly, it could create auditory illusions that exploited a listener's own knowledge and expectations. When it called my name with Julia's voice, it was working from information it gathered by listening to our conversations near the forest boundary. When it used Marcus's voice, it was working from something more intimate, perhaps sounds it had recorded or patterns it had observed directly. Marcus's logs started to make sense in a different way. His deterioration hadn't been psychological breakdown. It had been observation of something that was steadily learning about him. His routines, his weaknesses, his patterns of fear and response. By his final entries, it had probably learned enough about him to anticipate his movements. On November 2nd, I received a call from a ranger 2 districts over. A family had reported a missing person, a young woman named Sienna Cordova who'd been hiking the Eagle Ridge Trail 3 days prior and hadn't returned. Vincent's daughter. I drove immediately to the trailhead. The search had already begun. County deputies, volunteer teams from Millbrook, a state police unit with tracking dogs. Victoria had come in person, and when she saw me, her expression shifted from professional concern to something more like confirmation. "The Eagle Ridge Trail borders your district," she said. The last confirmed sighting of her was about a mile inside the Collector Creek drainage. One of the deputies told me. My stomach had inverted. The search continued for 4 days. They found Sienna's backpack 2 miles from the trail, placed carefully beside a stream, as if left as a landmark, but Sienna herself had vanished. On the evening of November 5th, after the search had been suspended due to darkness, I received a call, not on the ranger station line, but on my personal cell phone. "Jedediah," a young woman's voice said. It was Sienna Cordova's voice, but not Sienna. There was an underneath to it, a layering of something else. "I'm calling to tell you that he's taking care of me. He's teaching me. There's a lot I didn't understand before, about the forest, about what's real and what's believed. He says you're going to understand too." I tried to respond, but the call had disconnected. The next morning, I organized a team. Victoria was skeptical, but I insisted. I had jurisdiction, and I was requesting a formal investigation of the Collector Creek drainage with full documentation. We went in with 6 people, 2 county deputies, 2 volunteer trackers, Julia Voss as a local guide, and myself. We moved slowly, carefully, documenting everything. The bones from the pool clearing had been moved, not scattered, arranged. They were laid out in the clearing in a pattern that took me several minutes to recognize. It was a map, a detailed geographic map of the drainage system, rendered entirely in human and animal bones. The tributaries were mapped out in smaller femurs and humeri. The main creek was a line of backbones and ribs, and in the center, where the 3 tributaries met, a human skull had been positioned directly on a large flat stone. "My God," one of the deputies whispered. "This is a message," Julia said. And there was recognition in her voice, the tone of someone finally understanding something that had been obscure. We photographed everything. We took samples. We processed it all with the precision of people who understood we were documenting something that would be hard to explain. While we were working, one of the trackers called out. He'd found something about 50 yards downstream. A shelter. Not natural. Constructed. Branches and bark and material that looked like it had been gathered and assembled with intent. Inside the shelter were objects, hundreds of them, a collection. There were personal items, watches, jewelry, photographs, identification cards, many of them water-damaged and old. There were clothes neatly folded, There were bones again, smaller collections this time arranged with what looked like care, as if being catalogued or preserved. I found a backpack with the name Siena Cordova printed on a tag. Jesus, the deputy said. I moved deeper into the shelter. At the far end, there was a wall constructed entirely of journals. Dozens of them. I pulled one out with trembling hands. The handwriting was Marcus Hendricks. The entries were dated from after his disappearance. Years of entries documenting observations, experiences, something that wasn't quite madness but wasn't rationality either. March 15th, day 4. It showed me how to move through the water, not swimming. Something else. The water is warm from underneath. It comes up from deep. I walked into the creek, and the warmth held me. It showed me I didn't need to be afraid. June 10th, month 4. The thing I saw in the forest is not a thing. It's multiple things learning to be one thing. When it calls, sometimes it sounds like me. I think it's using my voice now. It's practicing using the voices it keeps. September 3rd, year 1. Julia came to the property boundary again. It let me know she was there. It showed me how to take her dog, not to hurt it, just to understand it. The dog helped me understand how she would move, what she would think. November 11th, year 1. Sienna came into the drainage. She was looking for something, a photography project. The thing recognized her need for beauty and used it. She was so willing to understand. She's in the shelter now, in the water room. She says it doesn't hurt anymore. She says she's learning too. I put the journal down. A sound from the back of the shelter made everyone go silent. It was a sound like water moving, or breathing, or something between those things. A wet, rhythmic sound that came from deeper in the structure than the shelter should have extended. We need to leave, I said. We moved toward the entrance, and that's when the scream came. One of the deputies, the one we'd sent to mark the GPS coordinates, screaming from the direction of the pool clearing. We ran. The forest that had been navigationable moments before became disorienting, the paths shifting, the angles of trees creating confusion. We ran anyway, moving toward the sound of water, toward what felt like exit. The deputy who'd screamed was standing in the pool clearing, pointing at the water. In the creek itself, something was moving. A shape that was aggregating, coalescing from the water into something with limbs and approximation of a form. It was learning to exist in a shape it could move with, learning with each moment that passed. And in the deeper parts of the creek, barely visible in the darkening water, I could see other shapes. Sienna, Marcus, others whose names I would later try to find, whose disappearances went back years and years into the history of this forest. They weren't dead. That was what made it worse. They were changing. Becoming something that could exist in the creek and out of it, something that could wear human voices and understand human concepts, something that was using them the way a hermit crab uses a shell. We got out of the drainage with everyone alive. The drive back to Millbrook was silent. The deputies filed reports that emphasized the remains, the evidence of multiple deaths, the indication of foul play without specifying how, but they didn't describe what moved in the water. And I didn't insist. I resigned my position on November 18th. Victoria didn't argue. She simply processed the paperwork and transferred me to a desk position in the regional office, processing incident reports from other districts, never setting foot in a forest again. Julia moved to a town in West Virginia. Vincent Cordova took early retirement and moved to Florida to live with his other daughter. The incident at Collector Creek remains officially unsolved. The remains in the shelter were identified as belonging to 4 individuals missing over the past 17 years. Cause of death, inconclusive. Investigation, ongoing but inactive. The area is now marked as restricted to authorized personnel only, though no ranger has been assigned to the Hollow Creek station since I left. I've read every account I can find. Missing persons cases in Appalachian region going back to the 1950s. People lost in ways that made sense individually but formed patterns when examined together. A hiker reported seeing something moving wrong in the forest. A family member found an item of clothing with no body. A search that went nowhere. Marcus's journals are still in the forest. I reported their existence to Victoria, and she said they'd been collected. But I sometimes wonder if that was true. I think the thing that lives in the Collector Creek drainage might prefer to keep them. They're part of its library. Part of its understanding. In quiet moments I remember the sound of multiple voices layered over each other, calling out at dusk. I remember the way the forest changed when I stopped believing it was just an ecosystem and started understanding it as inhabited by something learning to be predatory. I remember the creek that moved too slow, and looked too dark and smelled like iron and cold stone. I remember reading in one of Marcus's later journals a passage I didn't include in any official report. It doesn't eat the bodies, it incorporates them. The water is warm because of what moves through it, because of what learns through it. It's not malevolent. That would require intention in the way we understand it. It's simply learning. And once you know that's what it's doing, once you stop being prey and become part of the collection, the learning continues indefinitely. Sienna understands this now, she told me so, and I'm beginning to as well. The water will warm as we learn, the creek will flow with understanding, and someday someone will hear us calling not in human voices anymore but in sounds they recognize nonetheless. I don't go back to Appalachia. I don't hike anymore. I work data entry in an office 50 miles from any national forest, and I tell myself that every day that passes is a day further from the point of contamination. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the creek. Not the recorded sound of flowing water, not some rational echo, the actual sound of the collector creek, cold and wet and patient, moving slowly towards something it's learning to understand. And in that sound, I hear Marcus calling. I hear Sienna. I hear Julia, who never made it to West Virginia. I hear others whose names I never learned. The thing in the forest is still learning, and every person it takes becomes part of its voice, part of its understanding, part of its slow becoming. I was right that I couldn't leave. Victoria was right about that. Once you understand what the creek contains, you never really leave the collector drainage. You just move away from it geographically, while remaining within its reach. The water doesn't need to hold you physically. It just needs to hold your understanding. And understanding, once gained, can never be unlearned. My name is Coda, and I became a ranger at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear, not the kind of disappearing that involves running from the law or cutting ties with family, though both would have been easier. I disappeared into the mountains because I couldn't function in the world anymore. After the accident at the university, 3 students, 1 van, 1 moment of terrible physics on a mountain road where I was supposed to be leading a geology field study. I couldn't look at people without seeing their judgment, real or imagined. The National Park Service didn't ask many questions when I applied. They never do. They see the qualifications: 2 degrees, 5 years of backcountry experience, wilderness first responder certification. They see someone who speaks 6 languages, someone steady and methodical. They don't see the person who stopped sleeping properly in 2018. They don't ask why someone with my background wants to work the most remote station in Montana. When Director Morrison handed me the keys to Lone Bear Ranger Station that November, it felt like clemency. The station sits 17 miles north of Lake McDonald, accessible only by trail or by the rough service road that becomes impassable each December. That was the appeal. In winter, I would be alone, completely alone. The summer brought visitors, and I could handle summer, could handle the day hikers, the research teams, the occasional lost families that stumbled into my area. Summer visitors didn't stay long. They didn't look close enough to see what I was running from. The cabin itself was built in 1987 and hadn't been significantly updated since. 2 rooms, a wood stove, solar panels that rarely worked right, and a well that had seen better years. The nearest radio relay was 6 miles south. In bad weather, communication became unreliable. In winter, I might go weeks without hearing another human voice. I took the job in October, which meant 1 month to prepare before the season turned. Lone Bear Lake sits half a mile northeast of the station, the water a shade of gray-blue that never seemed to reflect the sky properly. Ancient western larch and Douglas fir crowd the shoreline. The forest here feels older than the rest of Glacier, even though that's not really possible. The trees are thick, and in certain places the canopy becomes so dense that you're never quite sure what time of day it is. That was my favorite part of the station, the density, the sense of being truly hidden. The previous ranger, a woman named Victoria who'd held the post for 4 years, left detailed notes. The coffee table in the cabin was covered with 3 ring binders, seasonal wildlife patterns, hiking incident reports, emergency protocols, maintenance schedules. Victoria had been a meticulous woman. Her handwriting was perfect, her observations precise. November through March is quiet, she'd written. Weather is the main hazard. Hypothermia and the occasional alpine injury from early season climbers who don't know any better. Spring is calving season. Keep distance from ungulates. Summer brings the crowds and with them the usual, lost hikers, dehydration, the occasional bear encounter. Fall is my favorite, quieter than summer, not yet winter. Victoria had underlined the last sentence twice. I understood why. I read her logs for 3 weeks before she left. absorbing her knowledge like someone studying for a test that might cost my life. She covered the basics: the water pump's temperamental valve, the fact that the radio worked better at the northwest corner of the cabin, the locations of the supply caches, the names of the local rangers I might call if something truly critical happened. One detail caught my attention, mentioned briefly in an October entry from the year prior. Strange tracks near the lake today. Not bear, not elk, not any track pattern I recognize. Appears to have been made by something moving on hind legs, but the gait is wrong. Spread the prints to a biologist friend. She suggested malformed bear or possibly a person in unusual footwear. Have checked the region twice since. No new signs. Closing as non-incident. I asked Victoria about it before she left. She was loading boxes into an old Subaru when I brought it up, and something in her expression shifted. She became very still, her hands gripping the box's cardboard edge. That was probably nothing, she said finally. The forest does weird things. You'll see what I mean. What kind of tracks? I pressed. She wouldn't look at me. Coda, the job up here is simple. You keep the hiking routes clear. You help people when they need help. You document the wildlife. Everything else, the sounds at night, the feeling that something is watching, the tracks that don't match anything in the field guide, that's just the mountain. It's just your mind trying to make sense of an environment that doesn't care about making sense, you understand? I did understand. I'd come here specifically because I wanted an environment that didn't care about me. I understand, I said. She left the next morning, her Subaru grinding up the service road until it disappeared into the trees. I watched until the sound faded completely, then turned back to the cabin and the responsibility that was now entirely mine. The first month was exactly what I needed. The work was concrete and purposeful. I cleared trail segments, repaired trail markers, documented the early snowfall patterns. I inventoried supplies, tested the emergency equipment, made sure the first aid kits were current. I fell into a routine. Coffee at dawn, 3 hours of work, lunch, 3 more hours of work, dinner, and then the long evening with whatever books I'd brought. The isolation felt like forgiveness. By mid-November, the weather turned decisively cold. Snow came heavy and stayed. The service road became impassable, and I confirmed that the radio relay was functioning before the weather made testing difficult. Director Morrison called every Sunday morning, and I reported that everything was fine. Everything was fine. I was sleeping better than I had in years. The dreams, when they came, were just dreams. November 19th was the day I found the first indication that something was wrong. I was checking the Northern Trail Loop, a 7-mile circuit that tourists used in summer. Most of the trails were now closed officially, but I kept the Northern Loop clear because the Forest Service biologists used it for winter tracking studies. The snow was about 18 inches deep, making the work slower but not difficult. I had good gear, good boots, and the kind of focus that comes from repeating simple actions. The cabin where I found the tracks belongs to a research program, a small structure used seasonally for storing equipment and providing shelter during the winter studies. It's maybe 2 miles from my station northeast of the lake. The tracks were in the snow leading up to its door. At first I thought someone else was working in the region. The tracks were human, bipedal, roughly the right size and weight distribution, but the spacing was wrong. The stride was too long, and the impressions were made by something that placed its weight on its heels differently than any human gait I'd ever seen. I photographed them with my phone, careful to include the cabin door in the frame for scale. Then I followed them backward, tracking their origin. They emerged from the forest about 40 meters northeast, from the direction of Lone Bear Lake. They approached the cabin, circled it once, and then departed, heading south toward the thicker forest near the ridgeline. The circuit had been deliberate. Something had approached the cabin, examined it, and left with purpose. My pulse was faster than the work warranted. I told myself it was exertion. The elevation at Glacier is nothing to someone acclimated to mountains, but the cold can take it out of you. I took more photographs. I noted the location and time in my incident log. 14 November, 2:47 p.m., unusual track pattern, source unknown, no evidence of intrusion to facility. That evening, I called the Forest Service biologists to ask if they'd sent anyone to the research cabin recently. The call went through to Dr. Melissa Park, who headed the winter tracking project. No one's been out there since mid-October, she said. We're minimizing site visits this year because of the early snow. Why do you ask? I described the tracks. There was a pause. Could be a person, she said. Poacher, maybe, or someone scouting the area for other reasons. We do get trespassers. Have you checked the cabin? Not yet. I came back to call you first. Go check it. Make sure nothing's been disturbed. And Coda? If someone's on the land without authorization, report it. We take that seriously. I drove the snowmobile back up to the cabin. The cabin's lock was intact, the inside undisturbed. Food supplies, scientific equipment, emergency gear, all in place. Whatever had circled the cabin hadn't attempted entry, it had just investigated. The tracks bothered me in a way I couldn't fully articulate. When I returned to my own cabin, I found myself checking the locks multiple times, something I hadn't been paranoid enough to do before. I also kept the fire going through the night, burning more wood than was necessary. The light from the stove visible through the single window. The radio crackled with weather updates at midnight. Snow was forecast to continue. The temperature would drop below 0 Fahrenheit. This was normal. This was November in Glacier. This was why I was here, for the isolation and the cold and the sense that the human world was far away. By the time dawn came, I'd convinced myself that the tracks were probably nothing. Victoria had said exactly this. The forest does weird things. Your mind makes sense of ambiguity through pattern recognition that isn't always reliable. I'd been a wilderness guide long enough to know that assumptions about wildlife can be wrong. Animals don't always move the way we expect them to. I made coffee and tried to read. I couldn't focus. The visit came on November 28th, and it changed everything. I was in the middle of winterizing the exterior equipment when I heard the vehicle sound. Something that hadn't happened in 2 weeks. Snow had fallen regularly, and the service road was theoretically closed. But a heavy truck was grinding up through the trees, chains on its tires moving with difficulty through drifts. A Park Service vehicle pulled up, and Director Morrison stepped out, along with someone I didn't recognize. "Coda," Morrison called out, "checking in on you." It felt like an intrusion, but that was my damage talking, not reasonable response. I walked over, keeping my expression neutral. Morrison was in his 60s, compact, a man who'd worked for the service 30 years. He smiled at me in a way that suggested he noticed my hesitation and didn't mind it. The other person was younger, maybe early 30s, with deep-set eyes and the kind of alert posture that suggested law enforcement. "This is Ranger Eleanor Cod from the district office," Morrison said. "We're doing some follow-up on incident reports from across the region. Nothing serious, just routine." "What kind of incident reports?" I asked. "The unusual tracks," Cardenas said. Her voice was steady and professional. "We've had them reported at 3 other locations in the past month. Park Service wants to understand if it's a pattern." My stomach dropped slightly, though I kept my face neutral. "I found tracks," I admitted. "I documented them and reported them to the Forest Service biologists. I didn't think it warranted escalation." "May we see your photos?" Cardenas asked. We went inside. I pulled up the images on my laptop, and Cardenas studied them with the kind of focused attention that suggested she'd seen something like them before. Morrison stood beside her, frowning slightly. "Where were these taken?" Cardenas asked. "At the research cabin northeast of Lone Bear Lake, about 2 miles from this station." "What time of day?" "Mid-afternoon. I was clearing the trail and decided to check the structure." Cardenas nodded slowly. "And you noticed the tracks at that point? They were in the snow leading to the cabin?" I followed them backward to determine origin. They emerged from the forest, circled the cabin, and continued south. "Did you follow them further?" The question caught something in me. I realized I hadn't. I'd followed them back to their origin, but I hadn't pursued them in the direction they'd gone. "No," I said. I decided it was probably nothing and called the biologist to confirm no one was supposed to be working the area. Cardenas exchanged a look with Morrison that I couldn't interpret. "Can you show us the location?" "Now, if you're willing. The light's good, and the snow will hold detail." The 3 of us took the snowmobile north and then overland toward the research cabin. The travel was slow, the snow deeper than it had been when I'd come out last week. Morrison sat behind me, his hand resting on my shoulder for balance. Cardenas followed on a second machine that they'd brought with them. The tracks were still visible, somewhat eroded by new snow, but still clear enough to see the strange gait and the unnatural spacing. Cardenas photographed them from multiple angles, then examined the snow itself, running her hand across the compressed surface where the creature, I was thinking of it as a creature now, though I'd trained myself not to, had walked. "How deep?" she asked. "Maybe 14 inches at this point," I said. 18 when it was made. She looked south, toward the denser forest. "And you didn't follow them?" "I didn't think it was necessary." "But you thought about it." It wasn't a question. I'd been transparent without meaning to be. "Yes," I admitted. "I thought about it. I decided against it." "Smart decision," Cardenas said, though something in her tone suggested she meant it seriously, not as simple reassurance. Morrison was moving in a slow circle, examining the tracks from different angles. "Coda, I want you to do something for me." I want you to get me all the incident reports from the past month, everything you've documented, and I want you to maintain a log of anything unusual, anything at all, and call it in, not just wildlife, not just the obvious, sounds, tracks, any sense that the boundary of your area has been violated. Is something wrong? I asked directly. Morrison and Cardenas exchanged another look. This time, Morrison decided to answer. There have been reports across the northern regions of unusual activity. We think it might be coordinated, though we're not certain of its nature yet. It could be a poaching operation, could be trespassers, could be a wildlife anomaly that we need to document. We're not certain, so we're not making assumptions. But we are taking it seriously. What kind of unusual activity? Tracks, mostly, Cardenas said. Unusual animal behavior. Some missing supplies from remote locations. One structure broken into, though nothing appears to have been taken. Nothing that points to a clear pattern, but enough that the service wants information. The previous ranger mentioned unusual tracks, I said. Both of them focused on me immediately. She did? Morrison said. Did she elaborate? Not really. She said the forest does weird things and not to worry about it. She also didn't seem to want to discuss it in detail. Victoria Huff, Cardenas said, pulling out a notebook. She left in October? October 18th. Do you have contact information for her? I didn't, but I could find it in the cabin's documents. We went back to get it, and Morrison made a phone call while Cardenas continued to examine my photographs and notes. Victoria was in Missoula now, apparently, working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. Morrison spoke to her supervisor, but not to Victoria herself. When he hung up, his expression was grim. She's in the field, he said. Won't be back until February. Her supervisor said she left extensive notes about anything unusual at the station. He'll have them reviewed. Cardenas looked at me. Have you experienced anything unusual besides the tracks? Any sense that someone or something is approaching the cabin? Any sounds? I thought about the way the forest sounded different at night, the way the wind moved through the pines in patterns that didn't seem natural. I thought about the night I'd kept the fire burning and couldn't sleep, listening to sounds I couldn't identify. No, I lied. Nothing beyond the tracks. I don't know why I lied. Professional pride, maybe? Or the desire not to seem paranoid? Or the understanding that if I admitted to feeling watched, they might remove me from the station, and I wasn't ready to leave. This place had become mine in a way I hadn't expected. Morrison and Cardenas left as the light was beginning to fade. They spent about an hour examining the cabin, the surrounding area, and the trail to my station. Before they departed, Morrison took me aside. You can leave if you want to, he said quietly. I can have someone here within a week to take over the station. No judgment, no impact on your record. This might become a more complicated situation and you shouldn't feel obligated to stay. I want to stay, I said. He studied my face. You sure? I'm sure. He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. Then stay alert. Keep the doors locked. Keep the radio active. And Coda, call immediately if anything happens. Not after, during. They drove back down the service road, and I watched the vehicle until it was swallowed by the trees in the gathering dark. That night, I locked all the doors and kept the fire burning. The wind in the pines sounded like something pacing. Every branch that struck the cabin walls made me turn toward the sound, but nothing came. The night passed with the weight of waiting, and at dawn I was exhausted in a way that sleep hadn't improved. 3 days of quiet followed, and I started to think maybe I'd been right to dismiss the tracks. Animals did strange things. Wildlife populations in Glacier included grizzly bears, black bears, wolves, wolverines, mountain lions. The tracks could have been any of them, distorted by snow compression and my own pattern recognition. But then I found the dead elk. It was December 2nd, and I was traveling the Ridgeline Trail, checking for avalanche hazard and snow stability. The elk was maybe 4 years old, a cow, lying in a depression between two snowdrifts. The snow around it was darkened and compressed, as if whatever had killed it had lingered for some time. What I noticed first was that it wasn't torn open. There were no signs of the frenzied feeding that predators create. Instead, the elk's throat was opened in a single, precise cut, deep and clean. And then the body had been examined. The internal cavities were emptied, organs removed with something approaching care, distributed in a pattern in the snow around the carcass. I'm trained in wilderness response. I know what bear kills look like, what wolf kills look like, what mountain lion kills look like. I've never seen anything like this. I photographed everything, noting the location in my GPS. The elk had been dead for 2 days, maybe 3, based on the decomposition and the rigidity of the flesh. The temperature had been well below freezing, which had preserved the scene. I called Morrison from the ridgeline, where the radio signal was strongest. "We need to come back." I told him what I'd found. "Don't touch anything," he said immediately. "Don't approach it again." "Where exactly are you?" I gave him the GPS coordinates. He told me to return to the station and await further instruction. I did as he asked, moving quickly, checking the trees around me multiple times. That sensation of being watched suddenly very acute. By evening, Morrison arrived with Cardenas and a third person, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, Dr. James Colton. The 3 of them went to the site, and I was ordered to remain at the cabin. They were gone for 6 hours. When they returned, they were quiet in a way that suggested they'd found something they didn't have a framework for understanding. We sat in the cabin's main room drinking coffee that had grown cold. No one spoke for several minutes. "It's not a known predator kill," Dr. Colton said finally. "The precision, I've never seen anything like it. The organs were removed post-mortem, which suggests the killer wasn't feeding, it was processing." "Processing?" I repeated. "Examining," Cardenas said. "Studying. The body was treated with deliberation." "What animal does that?" I asked. No one answered. The silence extended until it became uncomfortable. "We're going to increase presence in the area," Morrison said. "There will be rangers in the region through winter. You won't be alone anymore." "What are we dealing with?" I asked. "We don't know yet," Morrison said. "But until we do, I want you to maintain strict protocols. Lock all doors, keep the radio active, report anything unusual immediately. If you feel threatened, you leave. I don't care if it feels like overreacting. You get to safety." "Coda," Dr. Colton said, "have you noticed any unusual animal behavior, any signs of large predators in unusual locations, any sounds or activity that doesn't fit?" I thought about the trees at night, the way they seemed to move in patterns that didn't match the wind. I thought about the morning I'd found strange indentations in the snow behind the cabin, marks that could have been footprints if I was generous with the interpretation. "No." I lied again. The rangers stayed through the night and left at first light. They set up a temporary base about 5 miles south, at a trailhead. There were now 3 of them in rotation, checking the region daily. More resources were being allocated. Morrison implied that this was being classified at a higher level, that people outside the district office were now involved in trying to understand what was happening. I should have left. That would have been the reasonable choice. But something kept me there, not just the location but the mystery itself. I wanted to understand what was happening in my wilderness. I wanted to solve the problem that had attached itself to my station. Also, truthfully, I was no longer certain I could run from this. Whatever was here had registered my presence. It knew where I lived. Moving somewhere else would mean carrying this knowledge with me, the awareness that something was moving through the night with intelligence and deliberation. On December 5th, I saw it. I was at Lone Bear Lake at dusk, checking the northern edge of the water for any sign of activity. The snow was deep, but the lake's frozen surface was clear in places, wind scoured down to the ice. I was documenting any tracks or disturbances that suggested something had approached the water. The creature emerged from the tree line maybe 30 meters away, on the far side of a snow-covered outcropping. It was humanoid. That was the first observation that struck me, that it was roughly person-shaped. It was tall, maybe 7.5 feet, with proportions that were subtly wrong. The arms were too long. The posture, when it stood upright, bent slightly backward in a way that human spines don't accommodate. The face was in shadow, features indistinct. We saw each other. I know it saw me because it stopped moving entirely. For several seconds we were frozen in mutual awareness, separated by 30 meters and the distance of something more fundamental. Then it moved. Not toward me, away, back into the trees, moving with a gait that was part run, part lope, covering ground with impossible speed. It disappeared into the forest, and the only sound was the echo of its passage, the crack of branches, the disturbance of snow. I was running before I fully understood what I was doing. Back toward the cabin, the emergency beacon in my pocket activated, my breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with altitude or exertion. My hands were shaking when I reached the cabin, and I locked the door behind me with the kind of urgency that left no doubt about what I'd seen. I called Morrison's radio line immediately. He arrived within 2 hours, along with Cardenas and a 4th ranger I hadn't met before. I told them what I'd seen in as much detail as memory provided, which was less than I would have wanted. Everything about the encounter was clear in my mind, the height, the wrongness of the posture, the speed, but when I tried to articulate the face it slipped away. I couldn't hold it in focus. "Did it approach you?" Morrison asked. "No, It saw me and left. Did it seem aggressive? It seemed intelligent, I said. It made a decision to withdraw. Cardenas and the 4th Ranger were outside, scanning the forest with high-powered lights. They were looking for something. Morrison sat with me while they worked. "I'm going to recommend you be relocated," he said quietly. "This is beyond the scope of normal park operations. Whatever this is, it's not a standard wildlife concern, and we don't have the right protocols." "What is it?" I asked him directly. "Tell me what you actually think it is." He was quiet for a long time. "I think it might be a person, or people. I think there might be a community of individuals living in the remote regions of the park, and I think they've been doing so for a long time without our knowledge. Their presence suggests behavioral and physical adaptations that are concerning." "That's not what you think," I said. "That's what you're saying because the alternative doesn't have a language." Morrison met my eyes. "You're right. I don't know what I think. I know what I've trained myself to think, which is different. If you want my honest assessment, I don't have one. Whatever is here exists outside my framework for understanding." The searches over the next 3 days yielded nothing. Tracks were found leading through the forest in multiple directions, all of them bearing that same strange gait. One section of forest 3 miles north showed signs of regular passage, trees marked with scratches at heights between 8 and 9 feet. A path maintained through dense vegetation. It was the kind of trail that suggested long-term use, something that had been traveled many times. On December 8th, I was relocated. I packed one bag and left the station to another ranger. I wanted to refuse, but I was no longer certain of my rationality. The weeks of isolation combined with what I'd seen had shaken something foundational in me. I agreed to leave because leaving felt safer than staying, even though I wasn't sure that was true. But before I departed, I walked to Lone Bear Lake one final time. The snow was falling, light and loose, beginning to erase the tracks that had marked the area. The lake was frozen solid now, the ice dark where the wind had scoured it, white where the snow lay thick. The forest was silent in that complete way that winter achieves, not quiet, but the absence of sound, which is something different entirely. I stood at the lake's edge and felt the weight of the place. The mountains above, the forest around, the winter pressing down. Something was here, something that had its own pattern and its own understanding of the world. I'd come to this place to disappear, but instead I'd encountered something that existed in a deeper disappearance than I'd achieved. As I turned to leave, I saw the tracks. Recent ones, made since the new snow, approaching from the forest and stopping at the lake's edge just meters from where I stood. The pattern was deliberate, the approach purposeful. It had been here, recently, maybe minutes before I arrived. I never ran from anything. I just walked back to the cabin quickly, loaded my bag and left before dark. The service road was passable enough and I drove carefully toward the valley and the human world beyond. Morrison called me a week later to ask if I wanted to speak with anyone. A counselor maybe, or someone from the service's psychological support program. I declined. I told him I was fine, that I understood what I'd experienced might have been influenced by isolation and stress, that I appreciated the opportunity but was ready to move on. That was all true, technically. What I didn't say was that I'd lied to him. When I said I hadn't noticed any unusual activity around the cabin, I was protecting myself from the full implication of what was happening. Because in those nights when I'd kept the fire burning and listened to the forest, I'd heard something approaching the cabin regularly. I'd seen the prints in the snow, multiple times, different sizes, suggesting more than one creature, suggesting a group. They'd been studying me the way Dr. Colton suggested they studied that elk. Examining, processing, trying to understand what I was through the lens of their own impossible existence. I work at a desk now, managing permit applications for a regional office in Missoula. It's steady work. The lights are bright, there are people everywhere, and I've learned to find comfort in that presence rather than threat in it. But sometimes, on winter mornings when the cold presses against the windows, I think about Lone Bear Lake and the forest that surrounds it. I think about what still walks there, what continues its patient study of the boundary between its world and ours. I read the reports when they come through, the occasional incident, the tracks, the signs of something that the Park Service continues to refuse to adequately name. And I understand now why Victoria wouldn't talk about it, because there are some things that exist outside of explanation, things that meeting them changes you in ways that language can't capture. All you can do is survive the knowledge and try to build a life that doesn't require you to confront it directly. Some nights I succeed. Other nights, I find myself listening to the winter wind in the city trees, trying to distinguish between what the weather makes and what something intelligent might choose to create. I kept all the documentation. This might seem like the choice of someone trying to maintain evidence to build a case. The truth is simpler and more human than that. I kept it because letting it go felt like admitting the experience could be erased, that the weeks at Lone Bear Station could be reduced to stress-induced perception and rationalized away entirely. 3 months after my relocation, I was cataloging these documents: Morrison's incident reports, Dr. Colton's field notes, photographs of the tracks, sketches Cardenas had made of the pattern of unusual activity across the northern regions, when something struck me that I'd missed during the actual events. Victoria's notes mentioned unusual tracks, but she'd only documented them once, yet she'd clearly been concerned enough to investigate multiple times. Her brief mention was sandwiched between mundane observations about winter supply inventory and a request for repair of the cabin's roof supports. The placement suggested she was trying to minimize the observation, to nestle it among ordinary concerns where it might not stand out. I dug through the documents Morrison had left with me, a courtesy, I think, to ensure I understood I wasn't being dismissed without knowledge of what had happened, and found Victoria's full winter log from the previous year. Entries were sparse, ranging from 1 to 3 per week. Most covered standard ranger tasks, trail maintenance, visitor encounters, supply management, but interspersed through the entries were notations that, when read in sequence, told a different story than Victoria's brief summary. November 8th. Unusual sounds near Northern Trail Junction, multiple animals, vocalizations distinct from known wildlife. Approached area, all animals dispersed or silent, no traces found. November 14th. Tracks again, same location as before, different pattern. These suggest different individual. 2 separate creatures. Park Service contacted, will monitor. November 22nd. The researcher cabin examined. No signs of entry. Why approach a building? What compels the interest? December 1st. Found Victoria's tone changing, becoming almost conversational, as if she were writing to someone who would understand. The cabin has been marked. I noticed scratch marks at approximately 8.5 feet on the northern corner. Deep parallel lines created by something with significant strength and deliberation. This is the second such marking I've found. The first was on a tree near the lake, made perhaps 2 weeks ago based on the coloration of the exposed wood. Both markings have the same spacing between lines, approximately 4 inches, made by 4-fingered hands, made by something that understands the concept of territorial marking. December 8th. I'm no longer frightened. That seems wrong to write, but it's true. Acceptance is settling over my understanding of this situation. Whatever this is, it is not hostile toward me. I have been present at 3 locations where they were active, and all 3 times they departed my presence rather than approached it. Their intelligence is evident in this restraint. They are evaluating me, but they are not considering me a threat or a food source. This distinction feels important. The entries continued, becoming increasingly philosophical. Victoria described the creatures in greater detail, though never explicitly. Her language was always circumspect, always stopping short of claiming to understand what she was observing. But the pattern emerged. She had seen them multiple times. She had tracked their movements. She had come to believe they were organized, possibly social, and definitely intelligent. The final entry was dated February 14th. A week before she left the station. I am leaving because I am losing my objectivity. If I remain, I will begin to rationalize behaviors that should concern the Park Service. I will find myself hoping for encounters rather than documenting threats. This is not a safe space for me to occupy. The mountains have offered me something that the human world took away, and I am in danger of choosing the mountains entirely. Therefore, I must leave. For the sake of the service, and for my own sake, I must leave. I read that entry several times. I understood it at a level I hadn't expected to. Victoria had come to love the things that were moving through her station's territory, and in loving them she'd become compromised. Her role as ranger, as observer, as representative of human authority had become difficult to maintain. I wondered where Victoria was now. I considered trying to find her, to make contact, to discuss what we'd both witnessed. But I recognized the danger in that impulse. Connecting with someone else who carried this knowledge might feel validating, but it would also bind me more firmly to something I was trying to leave behind. Instead, I filed the documents carefully and tried to resume normal life. This was harder than expected. Working in a permit office meant processing applications from rangers, researchers, and outdoor enthusiasts across the region. I found myself reading incident reports more carefully than my position required. I noticed a pattern that no one else seemed to be tracking. The unusual incidents weren't concentrated at Glacier. They were spread across several parks: Glacier, the Beartooth Wilderness, parts of the Mission Mountains. The pattern suggested movement, migration even, or possibly the presence of multiple distinct populations. I wanted to bring this to Morrison's attention, but I also recognized that my interest had become something other than professional. I was being pulled back toward the mystery despite my efforts to distance myself from it. The catalyst for my decision to act was a letter. It arrived at my office, which was unusual, most correspondence now being electronic. The envelope was plain, no return address, and my name was written in handwriting I didn't recognize. I opened it at my desk, and my supervisor was suddenly concerned that I'd gone pale. The letter was from Victoria. "Coda," it read. "Director Morrison informed me of what happened at your station. I have been expecting this. Others have too. What you encountered is not local to Glacier. It is not isolated. The park system is being increasingly infiltrated by something that does not want conflict but is not content to remain unobserved. I cannot offer you more than this. Contact is not always a mistake. Some entities, when they recognize intelligence like their own, desire communication. You do not need to run. You need only to listen. I am located at the address below. If you wish to understand rather than hide, I can help facilitate that understanding." The address was in Missoula, just blocks from my apartment. I read the letter 5 times. I recognized it as what psychologists call a potentially risky communication, a person attempting to draw me back into a situation that had been determined unsafe. But I also recognized something else. Victoria believed she had information that could change my understanding, and she had taken significant personal risk to contact me. I kept the letter. I did not respond immediately, but I found myself walking past the address on a Saturday, seeing that it was a small house with a well-maintained garden, windows that suggested someone spent time looking out at the world. I did not approach. I did not make contact. But I understood that the choice to do so remained mine. The mystery had not released me. It had simply given me space to decide whether I would pursue it. It's been 14 months since I left Lone Bear Station. I've continued working in the permits office, and I've become quite good at it. The work is structured and manageable. The patterns I track are clear and follow logic I can understand. My supervisor has mentioned that I might be ready for a promotion to the regional level, which would involve overseeing permit applications across multiple parks. It's a reasonable life. Safe. I've made it a point not to read incident reports from the northern regions anymore. I've stopped looking for patterns. I've tried to convince myself that what I experienced was a combination of isolation, stress, and the psychology of someone already fractured by trauma. But the dreams returned in autumn. In these dreams, I am back at Lone Bear Lake, but I am not alone. I'm aware of presences in the forest, multiple observers, their attention focused on me with patient interest. In the dreams, I am not afraid. I am instead exactly where I'm supposed to be. 3 weeks ago, Morrison called my office. He asked if I would be willing to consult on a situation that was developing in the northern regions. He was careful to note that this would not require returning to the field, only analyzing data and providing perspective based on my experience. I agreed before I fully considered what I was doing. The data is extensive. The service has been quietly tracking unusual incidents for 2 years now, and the pattern is unmistakable once you're permitted to see it clearly. There is a coordinated population of intelligent beings living in the northern wilderness regions. They are not aggressive, but they are present, and they are expanding their territory in subtle ways. 3 ranger stations have reported unusual activity. Researchers have documented tracks in areas where they shouldn't exist. The service is beginning to confront the reality that the parks are not primarily human space anymore. They never were, but now that reality is becoming impossible to deny. Morrison asked me to prepare a report recommending either containment strategies or coexistence protocols. He's given me clearance to review all the documentation, including communications that haven't been filed officially. That's when I found the message. It was in the secure files, labeled as recovered digital communication, dated 1 week after I departed the station. It appeared to have been sent through an unusual channel, something that suggested both technical sophistication and knowledge of service communication systems. "Coda," it read. "You chose to leave. This is respected. You chose to leave because you feared what you did not understand, and fear is a valid response to the unknown. But your fear was not of us. Your fear was of yourself, of the possibility that you might choose to remain. that you might choose to abandon the human world because you had finally encountered something more real than the life you had been living. We understand this choice. Humans often require distance to process truth. But we wish you to know, the station remains, the lake remains, and we are waiting, not because we intend to change your choice, but because intelligences that recognize each other often find ways to meet beyond fear and misunderstanding. The mountains do not judge, the forest does not condemn, and neither do we. The message was unsigned. It came from a source that should not have had access to service systems. It was, in every technical and rational sense, impossible. I printed it and held the paper in my hands for a long time. Morrison has asked for my report within 2 weeks. He's recommended that whatever recommendation I make will significantly influence the service's approach to the northern regions for the foreseeable future. Containment would mean increased ranger presence, barrier establishment, attempts to limit expansion. Coexistence would mean designation of certain regions as effectively autonomous territory, marked on official maps in ways that would limit human activity without revealing why. This is the choice I am facing now. Do I recommend that the service attempt to control what it does not understand? Or do I recommend acknowledging that the wilderness is not ours to control, that some territories have always belonged to others, and that the most respectful response is to withdraw and establish boundaries? I think about Victoria at night, and I wonder what she would choose. I think about the creature I saw at the lake, that moment of mutual recognition, intelligence meeting intelligence across a distance that was both physical and something more profound. The dreams continue. In them I am always at the lake. And in them, I am always choosing to stay. The report is not written yet, the deadline is approaching, and I find myself thinking about the service road north, about the way December snow transforms the landscape into something pristine and absolute. I think about the truth that Victoria discovered, that accepting what I do not understand is often easier than fighting to deny it, that sometimes the most courageous choice is to acknowledge that the world is larger and stranger and more intelligent than human categories allow. I have not made my final decision, but I know which direction my heart is turning. And I know that the mountains are patient. They have always been patient. Some nights I stand at my apartment window and look toward the north, toward the mountains and the forests beyond. And I know that something is waiting there, something that sees me as I see it, as another being moving through a world of mysteries, capable of choice, capable of understanding. The question is no longer whether I will return. The only question remaining is when. I came to Glacier National Park on the last day of September, and I came running. Not the kind of running where you're fleeing something behind you, but the kind where you're trying to outrun something inside yourself. That's what the hiring officer probably didn't realize when I signed my contract. My name is Rowan Vickers. I'm 37 years old, and for the last 12 years I worked as a ranger in the Black Hills, doing standard patrol work, helping lost tourists, managing wildlife encounters, good honest work that paid poorly and asked a lot. I was good at it too. The kind of ranger people remember because I actually knew the land, not just the marked trails and emergency procedures, but the deeper patterns, how bears move through territory based on seasonal changes, why elk herds shift directions, the way weather builds in those ancient hills. But I burned out, not suddenly. It happened in the way that matters most, gradually, then all at once. 3 years of short staffing, 2 seasons of devastating fires, 1 lost child that I found too late. The accumulation of small failures and large ones. I started seeing things in the shadows of the forest that probably weren't there. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. for no reason, certain I'd heard something impossible. I was becoming the kind of ranger you wouldn't trust alone in the backcountry. So I applied to Glacier. It's remote, understaffed. They needed someone for the winter rotation at the easternmost station, Camp Ravine, which sits at the edge of the park's deepest wilderness. No tourist after October, no foot traffic. Just the mountains, the lake, the cabin, and whatever moves through that country when nobody's watching. The interview happened on a video call. The park superintendent, a woman named Grace Chen, asked me why I wanted the position. I need to be alone, I told her. It was the most honest thing I'd said in years. She didn't seem surprised. Maybe she'd heard it before from others who'd reached that particular breaking point. She offered me the job on the spot. The cabin at Camp Ravine sits about 40 kilometers northeast of the main park entrance, accessible only by a logging road that becomes impassable after heavy snow. It's a simple structure, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living area with a wood stove. The nearest other ranger station is 2 hours away by car. The nearest town is 3 times that distance. There's a lake roughly 2 kilometers north, Ravine Lake, and mountains in every direction. The trail system around the camp is extensive, though most routes get minimal use. I arrived with my equipment in September and immediately felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief, but something close. The mountains here are different from the Black Hills, sharper, younger looking in geological terms, though that means nothing. These are the kind of peaks that make you feel small in a way that's almost comforting. Grace came with me for the first 2 days to handle paperwork and orientation. She was professional, thorough, and I appreciated that she didn't ask personal questions. On the evening of the second day, as we sat in the cabin, she brought up the only strange thing. "You might hear stories about this area," she said carefully. "From other staff, from locals in the nearby towns." "What kind of stories?" "The kind people tell about remote places." She was choosing her words precisely. Indigenous oral traditions about the mountain country. Things that exist in folklore but not in nature. I understood what she meant. She was warning me away from superstition, from the kind of thinking that makes isolation dangerous. Rangers who spend too much time alone sometimes start believing things. Sometimes they see things that aren't there. "I'm not superstitious," I told her. "Good," she said, "because this job is hard enough without chasing ghosts." After she left, I settled into the routine of the work. October at Camp Ravine is beautiful in a way that feels almost aggressive. The larch trees turn gold as if the mountains are burning. The air gets thin and clean. Early snows dust the high peaks but don't stick at this elevation yet. I spent my days doing what rangers do, checking trail conditions, documenting wildlife activity, responding to the rare hiker who wandered into the area. I maintained the equipment, I filled out reports, I walked the trails. It was during one of these walks, in the second week of October, that I found the first one. I was hiking the Cascadia Trail, a moderate 7-kilometer loop that passes through subalpine forest before breaking into alpine meadow. It's not a difficult trail, but it's not heavily used either. The kind of place where you might not see another person all season. About 3 kilometers along, where the trail cuts through a particularly dense stand of subalpine fir, I found the hiker. She was approximately 30 years old, wearing a light day pack, and she'd been missing from a hiking party for 6 hours. Search and rescue hadn't even been officially notified yet. Her group had only started to truly worry. Her name was Rebecca Evans, and she was lost and terrified, but she was alive because she'd had the sense to stay on the trail instead of wandering into the forest. She'd slipped on a wet section, twisted her ankle, and couldn't walk properly. She'd been sitting on a log, waiting, afraid that moving would make things worse. I got her back to the cabin in 3 hours, treating her ankle with ice and elevation. She was shaken but unharmed. I reported her location and condition to the main station, and within a few hours her family came to collect her. She thanked me profusely and they drove away before dark. That evening, alone again, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Useful, simple, uncomplicated usefulness. Someone needed help, and I'd provided it. No complexity, no moral ambiguity, just the work. I didn't know then that this was the last straightforward rescue I would make from Camp Ravine. The weather shifted in late October. The early snows became regular snows. The temperature dropped below freezing at night and rarely climbed above it during the day. The larch trees lost their gold. The world became a study in white and gray and the deep green of evergreens under snow. That's when I began finding the animals. The first was a mule deer, a young buck, found about a kilometer from the cabin near the northeastern trail junction. At first glance, there was nothing obviously wrong with it. It was dead, lying on its side, no visible wounds that I could see from a distance. But when I approached more carefully, stepping through the snow, I could see its eyes. They were still open, but the way they caught the light was wrong. Not the glassy stare of normal death, but something that looked almost deliberate, like the deer had seen something terrible in its final moments. I checked the body for signs of predation, bite marks, claw wounds, evidence of struggle. There was nothing, no blood, no torn clothing or hide. The snow around the deer was undisturbed. It was as if the animal had simply laid down and died, and that alone told me something was wrong. Deer don't just die. Even starving, sick, or wounded deer show some sign of struggle. I filed a report about it. Grace called back the next day, seemed mildly interested but unsurprised. Wildlife deaths happen, she reminded me, especially in the early season before the harsh cold really sets in. Could be winter stress, she said. Weak animal that couldn't adjust to the elevation or the temperature shift. Maybe. But I kept thinking about those eyes. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 4 more animals. Another mule deer, this one older, a pine marten, an elk calf, though this one I found further away, nearly 3 kilometers from the cabin. Each one positioned carefully, I thought, though that was almost certainly my mind filling in patterns that weren't there. Each one with that same quality to their final stare, and each one with no clear cause of death. I began making notes, sketches of locations, date and time found, condition of the carcass, weather conditions at the time of discovery. It became a small obsession. I told myself I was being thorough, professional, but I knew the truth. The pattern was bothering me. Dead animals don't arrange themselves in methodical ways. Nature is chaotic. Death is messy. This was neither. By the first week of November, the snow was getting serious. The logging road was becoming unreliable. I made one supply run to the nearest town, about a 90-minute drive away, stocking up on non-perishables and fuel. The woman at the general store recognized me, or at least recognized the ranger uniform. "You're staying through winter?" she asked. She was older, maybe 70, with the kind of weathered face that comes from long years in mountain towns. "That's the plan," I said. She studied me for a moment. "Most people don't. Winter gets lonely out here, gets to you in ways you don't expect." "I like the quiet," I said. She didn't look convinced. "The quiet's fine until it isn't. Have you heard anything yet? About the area?" I knew what she was asking, without her having to be explicit. She was asking if I'd encountered the stories, the folklore. "Nothing specific," I told her. "My superintendent warned me about superstitions." "Superstitions are just things people saw and couldn't explain," she said. She started ringing up my groceries. "The tribes around here, they have stories about shape changers, things that look like people but aren't, things that look like animals but aren't. The old people used to say that in winter, when travel gets hard and people get isolated, is when you have to be most careful about what you invite into your space." I paid for my groceries and left. I told myself her comments were just small-town folklore, the kind of thing long-term residents recycled for visitors. But I thought about them anyway. I thought about them a lot. November brought the first real storm. It moved in from the north, a system that the forecasts said would dump 40 centimeters of snow over 2 days. I prepared accordingly, clearing the gutters, stocking the woodshed, making sure the generator had fuel. By the time the snow actually fell, I was ready. What I wasn't ready for was the silence. When a major storm hits a remote location, the silence becomes almost physical. No wind noise reaches you inside the cabin with the doors closed and the windows covered. Just the sound of the wood stove, the occasional creak of the structure settling, the sound of your own breathing. That's all. I spent the first day of the storm reading and maintaining equipment. The second day, I started watching out the windows. The snow was spectacular, cascading in heavy sheets that obliterated the view beyond a few meters. I could barely see the trees at the edge of the clearing. The landscape had contracted to just the small circle immediately around the cabin. That night, about 2 hours after sunset, I heard scratching. At first I thought it was a branch against the cabin wall, wind-driven debris, but it was too regular, too deliberate. Scratch, pause, coming from the south wall, near the kitchen window. I went to the window with a flashlight. The snow was still coming down hard, and the beam of my light didn't penetrate far. I could see the snow accumulating against the wall, the dark line of the foundation, the shapes of the landscape melting into white. Nothing else. The scratching continued for about 2 minutes, then stopped. When I went outside the next morning to investigate, I found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no marks on the wall or the cabin, just unblemished white around the entire south side. That should have been comforting. Whatever made the sound had either been imaginary or so light and small that it left no trace. Wind-driven snow makes strange sounds against wood. I know this. I've heard it 100 times, but my instinct told me something was wrong. The storm cleared by evening, and the temperature plummeted. The kind of cold where moisture freezes in the air, where your breath becomes visible and then seems to disappear, where the whole world feels suspended in crystallized time. I checked the trail systems the next morning, clearing snow from the markers, assessing conditions. Most of the trails would be impassable until spring without proper equipment and training, which was fine. That was the point. On the third morning after the storm, I found the elk. It was on the trail leading north toward Ravine Lake, roughly 2.5 kilometers from the cabin. A full-grown bull, heavy with winter fat, positioned at a bend in the trail where the forest opened slightly into a small meadow. The snow around it had been disturbed, packed down in a rough circle around the body, as if something had been walking around it. My heart rate elevated as I approached. This was different from the previous finds. This was a large animal, the kind that should have shown obvious signs of struggle if something had brought it down. But there were no drag marks, no blood, no obvious wounds. The eyes were open, and that quality I'd noticed before was intensified here. That sense of final awareness, of seeing something before the end. I forced myself to examine it more carefully, kneeling in the snow, looking for wounds under the heavy fur. Nothing. No claw marks, no puncture wounds, no evidence of disease or injury. The animal was simply dead, as if the act of dying had been instantaneous and complete. The disturbed snow around it bothered me most. The pattern wasn't random. The tracks, if you could call them that, seemed to move in a specific pattern. Not circular, but rather approaching from one direction, passing by the body, then moving away. The tracks were deep but oddly shaped, not quite hoof prints, not quite anything I recognized. I stood up, my body reacting with a flush of adrenaline. I told myself I was being paranoid. The snow was obscuring whatever had actually made the tracks. Wind and settling had distorted them. Predators had made the kill, and something else had investigated the carcass. But I didn't believe myself. I marked the location on my map and took photographs with my phone, not sure why. What was I going to do with them? And then hiked back to the cabin. The afternoon was advancing, and the first hints of sunset already colored the western sky. Winter days are short. It would be dark within 4 hours, and I didn't want to be on the trails when darkness fell. That night I called Grace. The connection was poor, cutting out intermittently, but I managed to give her a full report about the elk and the previous animal finds. "I'll file a formal report," she said. "But Rowan, this isn't unusual. You're in a remote area. We have predators. We have scavengers. Animals die regularly." "Without any marks?" I asked. "Sometimes," she said. "Especially in winter. Pneumonia, sepsis, internal injuries that don't show externally. There are a lot of ways an animal can die without visible evidence." She was right. I knew she was right. But the doubt persisted. After I hung up, I made coffee and sat by the stove. The cabin was warm, but I felt cold. There was something I wasn't understanding about the pattern. Not the dead animals themselves. Grace was probably correct about those, but the arrangement of them, the locations, the way they kept appearing in a rough arc around the cabin, as if marking out a perimeter. I pulled out my topographic map and marked each location with a red pen. The first deer, about 1 kilometer northeast. The second deer, almost 1 kilometer due north. The pine marten, roughly northwest. The calf, far to the east. The new elk, north again, further than the first deer. They weren't random. The pattern was loose, but it was there. They formed a rough circle around the cabin, spaced irregularly but persistently north and east, as if something was systematically marking territory, as if something was trying to tell me something. That night I didn't sleep well. I'd taken to wearing earplugs before bed, a habit left over from my Black Hills years when sound management was important. But tonight I removed them. I wanted to hear if anything approached the cabin. I didn't hear anything, but I woke at 2:47 a.m. with the absolutely certain knowledge that something was standing outside my window. I don't know what woke me. There was no sound, no movement that I could detect, but the awareness was complete and undeniable. Something was there, on the other side of the glass, in the darkness, looking in. I lay in bed, heart hammering, refusing to turn on the light. If something was really there, turning on a light would give it a better view of me than I had of it. The cabin was dark except for the ambient glow of snow-reflected moonlight through the windows. I don't know how long I lay there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. Time became strange. Eventually I convinced myself that the knowledge was false. A dream crossing over into wakefulness, the power of suggestion. I'd been thinking about predators and danger, and my subconscious had manifested that worry into a phantom presence. I turned on the bedside lamp. The window showed only darkness and snow and the vague shapes of trees beyond. Nothing was pressed against the glass. Nothing was visible at all. I checked the window latches, locked. I checked the doors, locked. I checked the entire perimeter of the cabin as thoroughly as I could manage in my pajamas and found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no disturbance, no evidence of anything having been there. But I had felt it. The presence had been as real as anything I'd experienced. In the morning, exhausted, I forced myself to go through my usual routine. Trail checks, equipment maintenance, weather observations. The routines that kept me grounded when my mind was trying to slide into unreliable territory. But there was a change in me now. The easy solitude I'd found in the first month had acquired an edge. I was no longer alone in a peaceful way. I was alone in a way that felt like being watched. That evening, I found the journals. They were in the cabin's back bedroom, which I'd barely used. I was looking for some old topographic maps that I thought might be stored there, and instead found a small wooden box under the bed frame. Inside were notebooks, 5 of them, filled with handwritten entries dating back to the previous ranger's tenure. Her name was Diane Kearns, and she'd been the ranger at Camp Ravine for 2 winters before the position had been vacant for a year, then offered to me. The first entry was dated November 15th, 2 years previous. The handwriting was careful, precise. Beautiful day. The cold has settled in properly. Looking forward to a quiet season. Saw fresh wolverine tracks near the North Meadow. Document noted. The entries continued methodically through November and December. Wildlife observations, weather notes, trail conditions. The voice in the journal was professional, competent, exactly what you'd expect from a ranger, until January. The entry from January 7th was where the tone shifted, something strange happening. Found another elk, the 3rd one this month. Again, no obvious cause of death, no predation, no signs of injury. Grace says I'm being too careful, too alert to small details. Maybe she's right. But they keep appearing in a pattern. I've drawn it on the map. It's like something is walking a perimeter around the cabin, something large, something that doesn't use the trails. After that, the entries became more frequent, harder to read. The handwriting started to deteriorate, becoming compressed and angular. January 14th. Heard something at 3 a.m. Came from the east. Not an animal sound. Something else. Something that almost sounded like, I don't want to write it down. If I write it, it becomes real. It stays real. January 22nd. I'm seeing things, movement in the trees. Things that look like they're too tall, too thin. Shapes that don't match any animal I know. Grace says it's isolation making me paranoid. She's probably right. Winter does strange things to people alone. But I've been careful. I've been maintaining equipment. I haven't been drinking. I've been following all the protocols. The final entry was dated February 8th. Nearly a full page, written in what looked like frantic haste. It came to the window last night. I saw it. I saw it. Diane, you have to understand what I'm saying. I saw it. It looked like a person, a tall person, thin, but the way it moved wasn't right. The limbs bent at angles. The head turned too far around. Its face had too many shadows even with the light from inside. And its eyes, they were on me, focused, aware. I tried to run. I tried to call for help. My phone had no service. I checked afterward and service came back fine. Like something had been blocking it. I'm leaving tomorrow. I'm quitting. I don't care about the contract or the job security. There's something wrong with this place. Something that lives in the mountains around this cabin. Something that's been learning how close it can get. And I think it's figured that out. That was the last entry. I later confirmed through the park records that Diane Kearns had quit 2 days after that final entry, citing a family emergency. She'd never returned to ranger work. According to Grace, she'd moved to Arizona and worked in real estate. I sat in the back bedroom for a long time, holding those notebooks. My hands weren't shaking. I was past that. I was in that place where fear becomes very quiet and very clear. The dead animals, the pattern, the presence at the window. They weren't isolated incidents or products of isolation-induced paranoia. Someone else had experienced them. Someone competent and trained had documented them. I was not imagining things. And whatever it was, it had driven the last ranger out of Camp Ravine. I had accepted this job specifically because I wanted to be alone. I had wanted to escape the complications of human society and lose myself in the pure, uncomplicated solitude of wild country. Now I understood that I had accepted the job under false pretenses. I had never been going to be alone at all. I didn't sleep for 2 days after finding Diane's journals. I told myself I was being rational, assessing information, making decisions. In reality, I was afraid. By the 3rd day, exhaustion won out and I slept 12 hours. I woke to a clear November morning, sun bright on the snow, and something had shifted. The fear hadn't diminished, but I'd moved past it into something else. A kind of acceptance. Whatever was here, whatever had driven Diane away, I was committed now. I'd come to Glacier to be alone, to face something. To find out if I was capable of standing still when every instinct screamed at me to run. Maybe this was it. I started keeping my own journal. Not the careful, professional observations I'd been recording before, but something more personal, trying to understand what I was experiencing. November 24th. Rereading Diane's accounts. The entries stop after February, which would be early spring, difficult travel season but not impossible. Whatever pushed her out did it fast. She went from professional documentation to fear in weeks. The transition is clear. I need to identify what caused that shift. The dead animals likely aren't the primary threat. They're signaling. Diane's language, learning how close it can get, suggests an escalation, a process. Whatever this is, it wasn't immediately dangerous. It was curious. Testing, learning. I need to establish some kind of baseline. What was here before? What is here now? I spent the next week methodically searching through the cabin for anything else that might provide information. I found old ranger reports, weather logs, some personal items left behind. Nothing else from Diane after she quit, but I did find something interesting in a file folder labeled Previous Incidents. There were 3 reports. The first dated back 7 years, from a ranger named Douglas Grant. It mentioned unusual wildlife activity in November-December period, animals found dead with no apparent cause, requesting wildlife biologist consultation. The consultation had apparently yielded nothing conclusive. The second was from 12 years back, same issue, different ranger, same time period, same mysterious animal deaths. The third was the oldest, 23 years previous, and it was different. It was written by a ranger named Robert Chen, and it was much longer than the others. I've been at Camp Ravine for 2 seasons now, and I feel obligated to document something that other rangers seem reluctant to address directly. The dead animals are the most visible evidence, but there's a larger pattern here. The Glacier's First Nations people who live in the nearest town have specifically warned about this location. They call whatever inhabits these mountains Atsuche, a being that exists between forms, not an animal, not quite a person, something that shifts. Several of the tribal elders I spoke with mentioned that the mountains around this cabin, particularly the high country to the north and east, have always been considered dangerous, not because of the terrain, though that's treacherous enough, but because of something else. They described encounters with beings that appeared human but were wrong in essential ways. The elders suggested that certain locations have higher concentrations of these encounters, and this valley is apparently one of them. I don't know if I believe this. I'm skeptical of superstition and folklore, but I can't deny what I've observed. The dead animals maintain a perimeter. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. Something is here, something territorial, and it seems to focus on winter months, when visitors are gone and staff is minimal. I'm recommending that Camp Ravine either be staffed with multiple rangers during winter months, or that operations be suspended until spring. Whatever is here, one ranger isn't sufficient for management. That recommendation had apparently been ignored. The next assignment had gone forward, and the position had remained single staff through winter. Now it was single staff again, and I was here. I sat with this information for a while. Folklore about shapeshifters. Organized descriptions of something that existed in some kind of liminal space. A being that appeared human but wasn't. A thing that the local indigenous peoples had legends about, that had prompted specific warnings. On one level, it was absurd. I was educated. I understood psychology. I knew how isolation and suggestion could create false patterns in human perception. I'd read enough about paranoia and delusional thinking to recognize the warning signs. On another level, I had found the dead animals. Diane Kearns, a competent professional, had documented escalating fear. Robert Chen, apparently experienced and thoughtful, had compiled evidence that something existed here that warranted serious concern. The folklore didn't change the facts. The facts supported the need to take the folklore seriously. On November 27th, exactly 1 month after I'd arrived, the situation escalated. I was doing a trail check on the morning route, about 2 kilometers from the cabin on the Cascadia Trail. The weather had been good for several days, and I was assessing conditions for potential winter use. Most of the trail was adequate, though snow depth would make it difficult after January. I was about 30 meters off the main trail, checking a secondary path that accessed a small alpine meadow, when I found the hiker. His name was Marcus Reeves, and he shouldn't have been there. He was fully dressed for a day hike, appropriate outerwear, a day pack, hiking boots. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with dark hair and a gray stubbled face. He was lying on his back in the snow, arms at his sides, eyes closed. At first glance, he looked like someone who had decided to take a nap. At second glance, he was clearly dead. My ranger training kicked in. I approached carefully, checking for any signs of danger, assessing the scene. No obvious trauma, no blood, no signs of a fall or struggle. The snow around him was undisturbed, which was impossible. If he'd lain down here and died, there should be evidence of movement, of struggle, of the final moments, but there was nothing. He looked placed. I checked for a pulse anyway, though I knew it was too late. The body was cold, Based on the rigidity, he'd been dead for several hours, possibly longer. I tried to remember if I'd heard any weather changes that might indicate a recent hike. No. The weather had been stable for 3 days. I radioed the main station immediately. Grace answered within minutes, and I reported the situation. "Full name and description?" she asked. "Marcus Reeves, early 50s, well-dressed for hiking. No identification on me currently. Stay with the body," she instructed. "Search and rescue is about 90 minutes out. Don't approach it further until they arrive. Photograph everything from where you are." I did as instructed, documenting the scene with my phone and camera. The photographs showed what my eyes confirmed. A dead man, carefully positioned, no signs of trauma, surrounded by undisturbed snow. The search and rescue team arrived at 2 p.m. They were thorough and professional. They photographed the scene, processed it carefully, and extracted the body. Over the course of their work, they found Marcus Reeves's identification in a pack. He was from Seattle, on a solo hiking trip for the long Thanksgiving weekend. He'd left his hotel Tuesday morning, saying he wanted to get some time in the wilderness before winter set in. Nobody had reported him missing. There had been no emergency beacon activated. His emergency contacts had assumed he was having a good hike and not to worry, but he was dead. In the middle of the backcountry. In an area that definitely should have been on his hiking route based on his skill level. An area he shouldn't have had any reason to be in. The medical examiner reported, after an autopsy, that the cause of death was acute cardiopulmonary event, likely myocardial infarction, heart attack. A man in his 50s had a sudden heart attack on a remote mountain trail and died in the snow. It was a credible explanation. It was a likely explanation. It was probably the correct explanation. But I kept thinking about Diane's journal entry. The way she'd written about something that appeared human but wasn't. The way it had looked at her with awareness. What if Marcus Reeves hadn't had a heart attack? What if something had caused him to experience a massive cardiac event? What if the fear had been so overwhelming that his heart had simply stopped? That night, back at the cabin, I added to my journal, November 27th. Found a body today, Marcus Reeves, 53, from Seattle. Official cause of death, heart attack. Unofficially, I don't know. The body was placed carefully, the snow was undisturbed. There were no signs of animal activity or trauma. For all the evidence suggests, something caused him to lie down in the snow and stop living. This is no longer theoretical. This is no longer about old ranger reports or folklore. Someone is dead. Someone healthy enough to be solo hiking is dead, and the method of his death doesn't make sense. Diane was right. This thing is escalating. It's gotten closer. Now it's not just testing perimeters. Now it's directly involving people. And I'm next on its list, I know this. The pattern has always been leading here. The dead animals circling the cabin. The presence at the windows. The arrival of a hiker whose body could be attributed to natural causes. All of it is building towards something. The question is, for 3 days after Marcus Reeves' death, nothing happened. No signs, no presences, just the usual winter routine. The calm felt worse than the disturbances. It felt like waiting, like something gathering itself. On the 4th day, December 1st, a severe cold front moved in. The temperature dropped to -20°C and a new snow system began to build. The kind of weather that makes travel genuinely dangerous, the kind of weather that isolates a remote location completely, the kind of weather that suggests whatever was coming would do so soon. The storm built through December 1st and into the early morning of December 2nd. By 6 a.m. we were into serious weather. Wind gusts that shook the cabin, snow falling so heavily that visibility dropped to just a few meters. The kind of storm that could last for days. I spent the morning doing maintenance and preparing. Extra fuel for the stove, water in containers, food accessible if the power went out. I moved through the cabin mechanically, but my attention was somewhere else, somewhere in the mountains, under the snow and wind, somewhere close. I'd kept a knife on me constantly since finding Marcus Reeves. A good fixed blade 8 inches long, sharp enough to draw blood with minimal pressure. I knew intellectually that a knife wouldn't help against something that could kill through inducing a heart attack, but having it made me feel slightly less helpless. Around noon, with the storm at its height, my radio came alive. "Camp Ravine, this is main station." Grace's voice, slightly garbled by static. "You okay out there?" "Status normal," I said. "Storm is heavy but manageable. Supplies are good." "Good. The forecast shows this clearing by evening. Just wanted to check in. You're getting isolated out there." "Acknowledged. Everything is fine." What I didn't tell her was that everything was decidedly not fine. What I didn't tell her was that I could hear something outside the cabin. Not wind noise. Something else. Something that moved with deliberate pattern. After we disconnected, I turned off the radio and stood very still. The sound was coming from above, on the roof. Movement. Careful, deliberate movement. Like something heavy was walking across the cabin's roof structure. My hand went to the knife. I knew a knife wasn't the right response, but it was all I had. The footsteps, if that's what they were, moved slowly. From the northeast corner, walking along the roofline, moving toward the center. The sound was wrong, too heavy for a person, but deliberate in a way that no animal moved. No natural creature walks across a roof in a storm. I heard the sound of something being dragged. Something heavy. Across the roof, toward the chimney. The wood stove was running. I'd kept it going for heat, and the chimney extended above the roofline by about a meter. Then I heard a sound I will never forget. A sound like fingernails on wood. Scraping. Deliberate scraping at the chimney pipe where it extended above the roof. I moved toward the stove, toward the chimney interior. The scraping continued, rhythmic, persistent. Something was directly above me, on the other side of the metal pipe. The scraping changed pattern. Instead of the nails on wood sound, it became heavier. Impact. Like something was striking the chimney from the outside, testing it, trying to figure out if the barrier could be breached. Then a sound that made my whole body go rigid with primal fear. A voice, not a human voice, but almost. Something that had attempted to sound human and failed in every way that mattered. It came from above, muffled by the roof and the wind, but clear enough to understand. It wasn't words. It was phonetic approximations. Sounds that approached language without ever actually reaching it. And then, from another direction, an answer. From the other side of the chimney, a second voice, equally not human, equally wrong. They were calling to each other, using the chimney as a conduit, trying to communicate through the barrier. I backed away from the stove. My hands were shaking. My breathing had accelerated. This wasn't something I could rationalize. This wasn't isolation-induced paranoia. This was something external. Something present, something that was directly engaging with my location. I moved to the front window. The storm was still raging. I could barely see beyond the porch. In the violent snow, I saw movement, shapes, more than two, multiple figures moving around the cabin's perimeter. Tall, impossibly thin, moving in ways that suggested too many joints, too much flexibility. One of them paused and looked directly at the window where I stood. Even through the snow and the darkness, I could feel its attention, its focus, its awareness. The thing Diane had described. The thing that looked almost human but wasn't. The thing that bent at wrong angles. Its head rotated to face me more directly. The motion continued too far, rotating further than a human head should be able to rotate. The face resolved slightly through the snow. It was roughly human-shaped, but the features were too smooth, the eyes too large, the mouth positioned wrong, running at a slight diagonal across what should have been the lower face. It raised one arm. The motion was jerking, unstable, as if the limb wasn't properly controlled. The fingers, too long, too many joints, pressed against the window. I moved away from the glass. My back hit the kitchen table. My hand was still on the knife, and I pulled it out completely, holding it in front of me with no clear idea of what I would do with it. The voices from the roof continued. More of them now. I counted at least 4 distinct sounds, all wrong, all attempting speech and failing, all creating a discordant chorus that made my teeth hurt. The scratching at the window intensified, not just the one that had looked at me. Multiple points of contact. Multiple sets of too long fingers raking across the glass and the frame. The window shuddered, the frame creaked. I backed further into the cabin, toward the back bedroom. My hyperventilation was making me lightheaded, but I couldn't control it. This was happening. This was real. There were things outside my cabin, directly attempting to breach the interior. The first window cracked. A spider webbing fracture that spread from a center point. The scratching intensified. More force. The frame began to strain. I ran to the back bedroom and found a chair. I dragged it back to the living room and wedged it under the windowsill, pushing it up hard against the frame. It wouldn't hold them. Nothing would hold them, but it might slow them down. It might give me seconds. The window broke. The glass collapsed inward in a shower of shards. The chair held, driven up slightly by the impact but maintaining its position. A hand emerged through the opening. One of those too long, two-jointed appendages. It reached around the chair frame, grasping at the air beyond, unable to reach through the obstruction. More hands emerged, more reaching. All of them that same sickly pale color, with too many digits that weren't quite fingers. They pulled at the chair, testing its stability. The wood groaned. The voices from the roof reached a crescendo. The scraping at the chimney became frantic, violent. I could hear the metal pipe beginning to move, worked at by whatever was assaulting it from above. I stood in the center of the cabin, the knife in my hand, completely surrounded. There were things on the roof, breaking into the roof structure. There were things at the window, working to dismantle the blockade I'd created. And there was something I could sense but not see, something present in the cabin itself. Something that had been here all along, waiting in the spaces between the walls. I did the only thing I could do. I spoke. "What do you want?" I said aloud. My voice was barely steady. "Why are you here?" The voices stopped. The scratching stopped. The reaching hands paused mid-gesture. The sudden silence was worse than the noise had been. Then, from somewhere in the cabin, not outside but inside, in one of the empty rooms or in the spaces between the walls, I heard a voice that was more human than the others but still fundamentally wrong, still bent and twisted. It spoke in English, though the accent was corrupted by something that made the words sound like they were being pronounced by someone who had only ever read the language and never heard it. "You came here seeking isolation. We have provided it. You came here fleeing something inside yourself. We have shown you something worse outside. The question now is, can you survive knowing what we are? Can you continue existing in our territory understanding that you are not alone, that you will never be alone?" The voice was coming from behind me. I spun around with the knife raised, but there was nothing there. Just the empty living room and the door to the back bedroom. What are you?" I managed to ask. "We are what the land is," the voice said. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We are what it becomes when humans arrive and then refuse to leave. We are the shape your fear takes when it realizes you cannot escape. We are the form that your solitude acquires when something else decides to occupy that space with you." The words were delivered with mathematical precision. No emotion, no inflection, just statement of fact. "Diane left," I said. "The others before her left." "Yes." They understood. They ran. "That is one option. You may choose that option. We will not stop you. The storm will clear. The roads will open. You can leave, and we will not pursue. But you will know. You will carry this with you. You will spend the rest of your life understanding that there are spaces in this world that do not belong to human beings, that there are territories where something else is sovereign." I looked toward the broken window. The hands had withdrawn. The chair remained in place, but there was nothing beyond it now but dark and snow. "What if I don't leave?" I asked. The voice was silent for a long moment. "Then you will become something we can study more carefully, something we can explore in depth. You will learn things about the boundaries of human endurance that no living human should know, and eventually, like all things that persist in our territory, you will contribute to the pattern." The meaning was clear. I would become like Marcus Reeves, like the animals, like the pattern that had been building since I arrived. I lowered the knife. My hands were still shaking, but the decision was clear. "I'll leave," I said quietly. "Wise," the voice responded. "You may begin your departure once the storm clears. We will not interfere with your leaving." And then, as suddenly as it had started, the assault ended. The presences withdrew. The voices ceased. The cabin, which had been filled with an overwhelming, suffocating sense of wrongness, became just a cabin again. I sat on the floor for a long time after that, unable to move. The storm continued to rage outside, and I sat in silence inside, waiting for dawn. The storm cleared by late afternoon of December 2nd, exactly as the voice had promised. By the time full darkness fell, the wind had diminished to manageable levels and the snow had stopped. It took me about 2 hours to pack what I needed, most of my personal items, documents, the essential gear. I left the rest. The cabin would be sealed and mothballed for the season. Grace would arrange for someone to come collect the remaining equipment in spring. I wrote a report for Grace. Professional. Dry. I documented finding Marcus Reeves, the search and rescue response, the medical examiner's findings. I said nothing about the storm, about the presences, about the voices. I simply stated that the isolation of the position and the severity of the weather had made me reconsider the role, and that I was resigning effective immediately due to personal reasons. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake, listening, but there were no more sounds. The cabin was empty except for me. At 6 a.m., as the first hint of gray began to appear in the east, I loaded the last of my things into the truck and prepared to leave. Before I locked up the cabin for the last time, I went to the back bedroom where I'd found Diane's journals. I packed them carefully into a box, Someone should know what happened here. Someone should understand that Diane's experience wasn't a personal breakdown, but a response to something real. The drive off the logging road took nearly 3 hours. The snow had closed it in several places, and I had to clear debris and navigate around drifts. The truck made it, though barely. By 10 a.m. I was at the main park entrance, and by noon I was in the nearest town. I went directly to the general store where I'd met the woman before. She was there, and she took one look at me and knew. "It got to you," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," I admitted. "It got to me. You're not the first," she said. She gestured to a chair. "Sit. I'll make coffee." While she made coffee, I told her about Diane, about Marcus Reeves, about what I'd experienced in the cabin. She listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally closing her eyes as if hearing confirmation of something she already knew. When I finished, she said, "The old people have many names for it. The thing that hunts in the mountains, the shape that has no true form, the loneliness that becomes something with appetite. They say it's been there since before the mountains were named, that it's part of the land itself. Some of the elders think it's a punishment, that the mountains punish those who try to hide in them. Those who think they can escape other humans by going far enough into wild country find something far worse." "What happened to Diane?" I asked. "She recovered, physically, moved to Arizona like I said. But she changed. She was a different person after leaving. She sold real estate for about 5 years, then just stopped. Last I heard, she was in a facility, psychiatric care. She couldn't handle being alone anymore. Became terrified of open spaces. Couldn't leave her house." I felt something in my chest tighten. "And the others? The rangers before Diane?" "Similar stories. They leave, they settle somewhere. They never go back to wilderness work. Some of them never go back to anything. The ones who'd been there longest seemed to do worst." I left the store with a cup of coffee I couldn't drink and a phone number for Diane Kern's sister. I would contact her later. I would tell her that her sister hadn't been crazy, that something had actually been there, that Diane's fear had been a rational response to an irrational situation. But for now, I needed to be away from the mountains, away from the high country, away from the place where the boundaries of the normal world had become so thin that things could press through. By evening, I was 6 hours' drive from Glacier, heading south toward civilization. The landscape was beginning to flatten. The mountains were receding behind me. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt watched. I felt something's attention on me even at this distance, and I realized that the voice had been right about one thing. You can leave the mountains, but you cannot leave the knowing. You cannot forget that there are places where something else is in sovereign control. You cannot unknow what you have learned about the fragility of human territory. I drove through the night, and by the next morning I was at the border. I had a choice to make about where to go next. I couldn't go back to the Black Hills. I couldn't take a ranger position anywhere. The idea of working in wilderness again, any wilderness, made me feel physically ill. I drove to the nearest city and checked into a hotel. I've been here for 3 weeks now. I've been trying to process what happened, trying to find some rational framework that can contain the experience. Mostly, I've been waiting for what happens next, because something was placed in me during those weeks at Camp Ravine. Something more than trauma, more than memory. I can feel it in the spaces where I used to feel solitude. I can sense it in the margins of my perception, waiting, patient, vast in its understanding that I cannot hide from it. It is not something I can run from. It is not something that needs to pursue. It is something that is simply part of me now. I'm writing this account because someone needs to know. If you ever are offered a position at Camp Ravine, or if you are given an opportunity to pursue isolation in the mountains of Glacier, I urge you to refuse. The solitude there is not the kind that heals. It is the kind that exposes you to something that has been waiting in those peaks since the land itself was formed. The thing between shapes still watches that cabin. It still marks its territory in the frozen meadows and high country. It still waits for the next ranger, the next person seeking to escape into wilderness. And it will never stop. It will continue to wait, as patient as the mountains themselves, as eternal as the cold that builds each winter in those valleys. I sometimes wonder if leaving was the right choice. If I had stayed, endured, perhaps I could have learned something, could have understood what the thing actually was beneath the fear and the wrongness. But I was afraid, and fear makes cowards of us all. All I know now is that Camp Ravine still stands empty in the mountains. The cabin waits, the lake remains, and in the high country to the north and east, something continues its eternal patrol. waiting for the day when another human chooses isolation over connection, when another person decides that being alone in the wilderness is better than being part of the world. And on that day, the waiting will end, and the teaching will begin again.